Yes, I've started the recording now, so please, the floor is yours.
Louise.
Thank you very much. Good morning, like you said, good afternoon, good evening. Especially good evening because we have today as a keynote lecture a Professor Cheng from China. Also, I would like to remind everybody to close your microphones so we don't have problems in the transmission or sounds that come about. It's been a pleasure working with Wilfred, and of course, it's a privilege to work with all the members of the scientific committee. Especially, I've been working with Elias Constantopoulos, and it's been a very nice experience. I will start just saying a few words about high culture in conflict. And just to take into account the title of the session. And one can establish or say that high culture is a theme, and the theme that vertebrates today's presentations. And as some definitions are put forward on high culture, the papers will deal with authentic works of art and individual creativity and the aesthetic pleasures associated with their appreciation. However, we can also find a perspective in which high culture is a context within which dominant ideologies can be challenged. And I hope we can have both today, since it's the duty and the power of architectural criticism. On one hand, the keynote speaker will critically address the situation of architecture and urbanism in Shanghai, his hometown. Cultural projects and buildings will be an important part of his considerations, introducing us to the main subject of the 4 papers that will follow. In the 4 essays that we have after the first break, we will find high culture embodied in one of the main architectures that encompasses it, the museum. We will address 4 museums, or our speakers will address 4 museums. The creation, the changes, the mutations of the buildings, but also the idea of the architect and his own variations through time. And finally, the modifications of other designers. Also, we will hear not only about the perception of criticism at different moments, but mainly the critical approach of each participant. We will travel through their eyes and their commentaries from Sao Paulo, Brazil, to New York in the United States, and then to Eskifehir, in Turkey. We will go from the middle of the 20th century to the last decade of this century, conveniently harbored by very well-known architects that put their best to project and build this 4 museums that we would look at. Now I pass the floor to Elias Constantopoulos to present our keynote speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louise. First of all, thank you, Wilfred, for this invitation to this conference with such distinguished colleagues we have worked with for such a long time, and especially to Louise for our collaboration. Now, it is an honor to have amongst us today's keynote speaker, Professor Zheng Shiling of Tongji University. Professor Zheng was born in Chengdu, Sichuan province in 1941. He studied at the Department of Architecture of Tongji University, where he also received his master's degree in architecture and his PhD in architectural theory and history in 1993. Zheng Shiling is a member of the Academy of Architecture of France, of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, an honorary fellow of the American Institute of Architects, and a laurea honoris causa of the Università di Roma La Sapienza. Between 1965 and 1978, he worked professionally as an architect at the Second Design and Research Institute in the Ministry of First Machinery. He has served as the Dean of the College of Architecture and Urban Planning at Tongji University, of which he was also the Vice President and most recently, Director of its Academic Commission. He has also been the Director of the Committee of the Preservation of Historical Areas and Heritage Architecture of the Shanghai Urban Planning Commission, President and Vice President of the Architectural Society of Shanghai, Director of the Institute of Architecture and Urban Space of Tongji University since 2001, and Chief Curator and Consultant for the theme deduction of Expo 2010 in the Bureau of Shanghai World Expo Coordination. I will only mention, so as to leave more time for his lecture, a few of his publications and works. His main publications include a wide-ranging number of subjects, such as On the Rationality of Architecture, the Value System and Symbolism of Architecture, Architecture Criticism, Architecture and Art, Expo and Architecture, as well as research on planning and architectural design for Expo 2010, World Cities Shanghai, which was co-authored with Alan Balfour, as well as the definitive study on the evolution of Shanghai architecture in modern times, published in 1999 and republished in 2020. Professor Zheng Shiling's main design work since 1970 and well into the second decade of the 21st century include industrial buildings, such as the Chinan Second Machinery Factory and the Hangzhou Boiler Factory, art museums, such as the Chuchizan and the Qian Chuntao in Haining, high schools in Gezi and Fuxing, public service buildings such as the Jiaxing City Hall, the Finance and Taxation Museum of China in Hangzhou, and the Bund Public Service Center in Shanghai, and special projects such as the Nanpu Bridge, the Nanjing Road Urban Design, and the Sheshan Observatory Tower. What comes forcefully through this impressive outline of his academic and professional work is his in-depth involvement in the evolution of modern urban environments, and in particular of Shanghai, and also his astute and critical approach to architecture. This critical position, which he will address in his speech today, poses a question for us to consider. Is this the end of architectural criticism? Professor Zheng Shiling, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elias. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for everyone. I'm very honored to present today online. My topic is the end of architecture criticism. This is Shanghai after the large-scale construction. And in China, during the large-scale urbanization since 1990s, many years, millions of buildings and billions of floor areas are built, and that's the situation. About 30,000 high-rises over 24 floors have been built, constructed in Shanghai today. In China, over 24 meters buildings is called high-rise building. and more than 200 meters, it's called super high-rise skyscraper. And 40 years ago, the statics were 121. So we can say that the situation form follows profit, form follows authority, form follows performance, form follows code, and the form follows capital, and not just the form. And think of the technology, construction industry, and also building material. Architecture expresses social values. Architecture is no longer just imagined architecture, as we know. Architecture is not that designed by architects already. Those buildings in Shanghai and other cities, it's not the classicism revival. It is the sense of value and the taste of architecture. And those buildings not in Shanghai, but the strange shape buildings with non-architecture language erected already quite a lot. A hotel is like 3 stars, gods of happiness, official position, and longevity. And also a museum is like a swan, and the office building like a bottle of liquor. In China, architects experiments no matter where, when, what, and for whom. In historical areas, many architects would like to change the texture and to dig a network of waters and lakes. The design concepts were designed also by star architects. They are flying people. To understand the architecture criticism, we first of all, we have to discuss the nature of architecture and also the nature of architect. There is a confusion and a contradiction about both. Today, the traditional meaning of architecture and the architect has changed greatly. There are always the voices to describe the end of architecture, the death of architecture criticism. In 1995, at the Vienna Architecture Conference, a group of architects from Austria, United States, England, and Spain raised the question of the end of architecture. They recognized that in reality, architecture does not solely depend on the architect. It implies the second question, the end of experimentation of grand designs. Professor Jan Borden, director of the UCL Bartlett School of Architecture, he declared the death of architecture. Architecture has a long tradition of giving birth to the future. Architecture, as we knew and conceived, is already dead. There are always the voices to describe the end of architecture, death of architecture criticism. Today, the criticism is more comment-oriented. The criticism is more media's preoccupation. The criticism is a more popular affair. The criticism is less theory-oriented. In 1567, French architecture, Philibert Delorme, defined the ideal architecture. He called it the two architect. Two architects work on wind feet through Luxor's private garden, far from all worldly affairs, close to a temple of a meditation. He has 4 hands, 4 ears, and 3 eyes, 1 to watch God and his work, and 2 phantom history, 1 to deserve and evaluate the current way of the world, and the other 1 to foresee the future. In the history, once the architect has been named Il Divino Artista or Homo Universalis. Even God is also architect, but then the architect has been named as the master of space, the conductor of symphony orchestra, etc. Today, the architect is a businessman, an artist, an engineer, a fashion designer, a developer, a sociologist, a philosopher, a radical innovator, a second condenser, or a spatial administrator. Japanese architect Dada said, as the virtual world permeates our society, an increasing number of people claim to be architects. They are the result of economic condensations. They are put together by formula, and they are the final result of endless negotiations. Rem Koolhaas said, architecture, non-architects. Today, more buildings are not designed by professional architects, but by engineers, builders, or by officials, developers. In China, about 40,000 inhabitants per 1 architect. But in USA, it's 1,429, and in Italy, even 414. For these reasons, most buildings are ugly, useless, and wasteful. Architecture has been taken over by the global development industry. Architecture criticism can use those mediums, writing, for example, books, papers, in internet, on conference, forum, seminar, workshop, lecture, exhibition, sculpture, painting, movie, photography, literature, music, even fashion, etc. Like those conferences, forums, seminars, workshops, exhibitions, awards, as also other medium for architecture criticism. By definition, as Frank Gehry said, a building is a sculpture because it is a 3-dimensional object, but there is a moment of truth that is very similar between art and architecture. It's exhibited on the 2008 Biennale of Architecture in Venice. Architecture has increasingly become an interplay between sculpture and the building. It is one of the most intriguing phenomena in 20th century art, especially as installation art and sculpture. As curator of 2008 Architecture Biennale of Venice, Professor Besky said, architecture is a way of representing, shaping, and offering critical alternatives to the built environment. It is a tangible sense. Architecture is that which allows us to be at home in the world. And in other place, he said, architecture is not art, nor art architecture. Yet the two seem to be approaching each other. I would argue that it's not a question of fashion or fatal attraction, but one of responding to the traditional task proper to built fields. It is entirely possible that a third joint endeavor is coming into being, for which we have no proper name and which might also give rise to attempts to remake our reality. Professor Manfredo Tafuri, he raised in his book, Theories and the Architecture Story, he said, theoretically, can we justify the hypothesis that architecture, or more in general art, is automatically criticism? And it is proved also by Professor Bruno Sevi. He said, in point of fact, a great many works of art, even very famous works of art, are of a critical nature. You can use words to write a poem, or just to tell a story or criticize an event. Great critics who used the medium of words to express not then feelings, not their feelings, but their ideas. And it is the sense, it is the same with architecture. So we can see those buildings, architectures as a criticism in history. In China, Professor Feng Jizong, he founded the new direction in 20th century Chinese architecture. His work are the model for architecture criticism. Here we can see a tea house designed in 1963, and also another pavilion for tea house in 1983. And you can see also the tectonic of the buildings. Those buildings are by Chinese young architects. They have contributed also to be the architecture of criticism. Frank Lloyd Wright considered architecture is a form of communication. That architecture is media, he said. The rapidly changing media landscape has impacted architecture criticism and has shifted both models of criticism and the media in which it is published. The most journalists that have done for architecture criticism is for architecture to be reduced to a matter of image, and their criticism is a form of art criticism. In 2005, an international seminar organized by the Akahan Award for Architecture in association with the Kuwait Society of Engineers has been held. The theme is architecture criticism and journalism, global perspectives. Actually, the first architecture criticism in modern China was also published in some media like Shenbao, it's Chinese daily news since 1872, and also other Dian Shizai pictorial since 1884, and illustrated news since 1884. You can see just a constructed custom house presented here. And also you can see at that time, the new buildings has been published for the public. So architecture criticism is about evaluation, assessment, comment, classification, analysis, and interpretation of buildings. In other words, a long-term activity. Architectural critics should be multidisciplinary and professionally oriented. The critics category, including historian, theoretician, academic, philosopher, architect, designer, curator, author, editor, journalist, etc. In China, also in Shanghai, from 2001 to 2021, 499 projects for design proposal collection were processed by the Shanghai International Tendering Co. Ltd. Of these, about 15%, or we can say 74 were architecture projects. Since 1980, in Shanghai, a total of 200 projects were examined by jury. So the jury plays a very important role for the architecture criticism, because in China, since the last 30 years, we have held the most international architecture competition, or we can say the scheme proposal collection. You can see the jury like this. The one for the Beijing airport, and also for Hong Kong Design Institute, and other things in other cities. Today, the jury for architecture design competitions is playing an increasingly important role in its capacity as a form of architecture criticism. The jury will deal with architecture design, interior design, urban planning, urban design, landscape architecture design, and also the preservation and the renovation of historical building, etc. The jury would review the standing buildings, a complex of buildings, urban design, the urban regeneration, or a bigger area, etc. The design team would usually consist of multidisciplinary professionals. Also, the jury will pay more attention to its critical value, and today its environmental value and the ecological value. The jury's tasks of architecture criticism include selecting the appropriate architect for the project, suggesting the program for the project. At midterm, the jury would remind the architects of the program and confirm the design concept, selecting the appropriate design schemes for the final decision, suggesting future design developments. During the realization of the projects, commenting on the construction, dealing and the detailing and also a choice of materials. That's very early. Also, we can say in Shanghai Grand Theater competition in 1994. It's an early case of international architecture competition. You can see the built theater and the other projects. And recently, since 2016, the design competition for the Shanghai Grand Opera. It's a two phases competition. Altogether, 7 schemes presented, and finally we select the left one. And also, this is also a new competition for the Pudong Art Gallery since 2016. The location, the site is very important. And finally, won by French architect Jean Duver. And this is also a new competition, just constructed, the Astronomy Museum. We can say the jury has helped to promote the projects. Jean Nouvel, he designed the Shanghai Pudong Art Gallery. His first proposal, like the upper one, he proposed was a bigger bird-like roof. On the nearby site, a bird-like restaurant just demolished. So the concept of the domain for art gallery is also excellent. But the jury asked the Jean Nouvel not to use this bird-like big roof and to find other concept. And he accepted and changed the idea for the second phase. His design proposed a fourth space inspired by Marshall Duchamp, the large Gras. He has won the project, and the gallery was opened in July of this year. And for some important projects, when jury member takes on the responsibility, our jury member takes the responsibility during the whole design and the construction process. The international competition for the new development bank was also held with the 2 phases in 2016. And the building built in this year and opened just in September. The jury recommended a modification for the winning design has been suggested to be modified. That is, the jury suggested 5 instead of 4 horizontal parts, as well as recommended some materials. After the modification, the competition has improved. The composition has been improved. And for a building very old, constructed in 1908, a home building, the jury coordinated the developer, the administration office, and also traffic authority in order to preserve the building, to preserve the facade and have a building going up. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Zheng, for not only a very good lecture, but for keeping the time like this. Louise will coordinate the discussion. We have until 5. Louise, may I just say one thing before you start?
Yes, yes.
I think that today's lecture keynote lecture joins well to yesterday's keynote lecture by Kenneth Frampton in its essence, especially with the images that and the comments that Professor Zheng made in the beginning. And I'm thinking of the reference by Frampton yesterday during the discussion to Tadao Ando. You also mentioned Tadao Ando. And what he said was that I think that over a certain height, architecture is no longer possible, referring to the production of artifacts, architecture as an artifact in a global neoliberal economy. I think your lecture joins very well to that. And also it is very close, I think it was mentioned yesterday, to the spirit of the 2006 Venice Biennale from different approaches. Both myself and Wilfred were there, which had at its heart the issue of cities, architecture and society, and the issue of scale, the fact that these mega cities, the metropolitan megalopolis, where more than half the population of the earth will be residing, was an important issue we had to deal with. This, just as a very quick response, and Louise, please, you take.
Yes, I would. There is an echo of what I say. I enjoyed very much your presentation, Professor Zheng.
Thank you.
And I was puzzled by what you put forward as depth of architecture and depth of architectural criticism. And then you reverse it by saying, maybe it is not dead because there's been competitions with good outcomes and the criticism has been made by the jury. Can you enlarge in this regard?
Yes. In my mind, the traditional meaning of architecture and the architecture criticism already changed quite a lot, greatly. So we should find other situation, other direction for architecture and architectural criticism. For example, architecture criticism not now in the world, I think mainly for media, the most critics are journalists and they are media oriented. But every architect, they have their own self-assessment for their project. So this is also a kind of architecture criticism. And also because in China, I have said this a new situation for us because we have had the most competition in the world. So the jury has given also architecture criticism. And the jury, not just by one person, it's by a group of professionals, architects, engineers, and also developers and so on. Their criticism is different from the usually the architecture critics. So they have their own procedure. Sometimes perhaps the result is not very idealistic, but sometimes like we have shown the Pudong art gallery by Jean Nouvel or the New Development Bank and so on. It's good because the jury have selected the right one. But sometimes the jury has also different selection and also no unit idea, no just the same result for that. So we have to rethink of our future for architecture criticism. Architecture and architects and architecture criticism is no more the traditional one. as we have new and conceived. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Zheng. I really don't think I agree with it, but I respect it. And I would ask to the persons present if they want to ask a question or to add up on this, because here I think we have present several, if not many, architectural critics, and maybe they're not part of a jury.
Yeah, the jury sometimes consists of different professionals. Sometimes they have different idea because they have a different background. So the result cannot be identified previously. And the final result should be the result of vote.
Yes, I totally agree with you. I've been sometimes in a jury, and it's a very interesting and engaging work. Would you care to say something, Wilfred?
Yes, thank you, Louise. In many ways, the situation is quite parallel between China and other places. You have professional juries that are composed of a number of architects, engineers, client representatives, and so on. So there is very little difference. And somewhat belatedly, China has also had these, what Robert Venturi called duck buildings, buildings that don't look like architecture, but look like something else, like a teapot or a swan or three holy figures, human figures out of Chinese literature. And there has been a state decree that President Xi Jinping announced a few years ago, that there should no longer be any strange buildings. So how is that having an effect on Chinese construction? This is one question I have. And the other question I have is, do you think that there will, or that juries will continue to have an impact the way that they do? Because it seems to me that they have an enormous influence if, for example, you can change a design such as Jean Nouvelle's fluent wing-like project into something quite boxy. That is a tremendous alteration of a design.
Yeah, thank you, Wilfried. President Xi Jinping has said, don't construct the strange building. And he didn't give some definition, criteria for strange building. And in Chinese, it's called a strange building. So we can say these strange form buildings, but no criteria for that. So it's also not clear which kind of is strange building. And so sometimes maybe a creative, a new direction building maybe will be denied also. So sometimes the decision maker is not an architect, it's by government officials, and they are from different background. So in China, many different buildings constructed. Sometimes they accepted the figurative buildings, not the abstract buildings. So for strange, I think some creative buildings is strange because we didn't see before, but it's very difficult to define those strange buildings. So every city now is very careful to not to construct a very strange building. Yeah.
Louise, we have you have to unmute, Louise.
Thank you, Professor. I will read some of the questions we have because I think they're very interesting. Since we maybe don't have time for you, Professor, to react to them, I will just put the floor for an end conclusion of you, and then I will give the floor to Sengulgur to also make personally her own question, but this arrived before. On one hand, and I'm going to kind of make a summary of them. But Lynette Wider says, if
I have answered that first part. I have written, shall I say it?
Okay, no, that's all right. Carlos Comas says, and that's very simple, who appoints the jury members? Because they, by being appointed, they instantly become critics, and maybe they're not. And Hofmeier says, if there are 200 competitions, but 30,000 buildings done, what happened with the rest? Where is the influence of the jury in those other so many buildings? And Ruth Verde Zane says, thank you for your lecture. It responds to the conference on the possibility of criticism to help the creation of a better built environment. Nevertheless, for a jury to have such power to decide and to convince the author to follow their criticism is quite a unique experience to most of us. How that works in China, meaning how are the mechanisms to make that work? And then there are also other questions. I'm sorry, I think we're over the time. Sengul, if you want to take the floor.
Thank you very much. I'll try to be very concise. I'm very, very happy to have listened to Professor Zheng because it comes from the other side of my world. And I loved a lot of points you have made, Professor Zheng. There is only one addition I'd like to make. You said criticism is, what's it? Is more comment-oriented. It's more media's preoccupation. It's more popular affair. It's less theory-oriented. It was, I think, about 1995. In the last decade of the 20th century, Michael Benedict wrote a very small book, and but his article on criticism was even more interesting, and I think I'm for the ideas conveyed in the article. Yes, most of what you say is correct, but the reason is that it is very difficult to take the power against you. It might be the political one, the financial one, whatever. Martin Reinhold in New York is dealing with the suburbia, and it's a real big struggle. But he could not manage to stop the land from foreclosing, the owners' houses from foreclosing. I mean, very good social, political, community-oriented, the future of community-oriented criticism, unfortunately, does cannot serve its purpose. That's maybe the major reason why we are dealing with minor details. We cannot defeat the politicians, the enterprises, and the way they see a future for us. It is very difficult to change this. But the rest, I enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sengul. I think just to try to be on time, if we can have the last remarks by Professor Zheng.
Yeah, thank you very much. In China, we have also many international tendering companies, not just the Shanghai International Tendering Company. So they will deal with so many different projects. Now in China, every government background buildings should go through competition, goes through proposal collection. The jury member will be appointed sometimes by the administration government office and also the tendering company together. And quite often they will ask the China Architectural Society and the university to help them to form the right jury for that. So thank you very much, because I presented some things on the background of China. It's totally different from the other country maybe. And also because we have international competition, the jury member should know many things, know the international background and also know the different culture together. So it's also very hard work and hard responsibility. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I guess, Wilfred, please go ahead.
I just wanted to say that actually there aren't that many differences between China and some European countries, because also in Germany, there are sometimes juries where members of the jury are seconded to a long-term service to oversee the development of a building, and they make recommendations to the client. So there's no difference in that. And of course, that means that the jury members wield a lot of power. That happens. And so there's absolutely no difference. The question is who appoints them. And in Germany, jury members are also appointed by the government. So, you know, and it's also political, and therefore there's no difference. The real question is, you talked about creativity, you talked about innovation, and you talk about quality. And those things are all the same all across the world. So we are dealing with the same problems everywhere, and we have similar instruments and processes. Just the debates are different slightly, and we don't have so many strange buildings in Europe as you do in China or in the United States.
That also answers an interesting question by Robert MacArthur in the end and Alexander Staub. So I think Wilfred discovered that. And we're on time.
And we're on time. We thank Professor Zheng. We thank Elias for the presentation, and we'll meet again in 10 minutes.
We'll take a 10-minute break, and of course, everybody has a chance to continue the discussion at the round table. So I hope that you can continue to stay with us, Professor Zheng,
Yes.
until later. I know it's late in China, but thank you very much. And we'll be back at 10 past the hour.
Thank you.
那个等一下，如果关机是怎么？
Acabei de desligar a transcrição. Não, a transcrição só funciona em inglês.
Did Wilfred write something? Wilfred, did you write something on chat? Disappeared.
I just
Cancelled. Okay, fine. So we can start. Yeah. So good evening again, or good morning, or good afternoon. Our next speakers are Carlos Eduardo Comas and Marcos Almeida. Carlos Eduardo Comas studied architecture in Porto Alegre, Philadelphia, and Paris. He has written and lectured extensively on modern architecture and urbanism, with particular attention to Brazil and Latin America. He was one of the curators of Latin America in Construction, Architecture 1955-1980, the 2015 exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and one of the editors and contributors to its catalog, as he is a renowned authority on the subject. Professor Emeritus of the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul in Porto Alegre, he is also a member of the advisory board of IFAN, Brazil's National Heritage Institute, and of the advisory board of Docomomo, Brazil. Marcos Almeida is an architect, a teacher, and a PhD candidate at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, focusing on the lives and works of Lucio Costa and Oscar Niemeyer. The subject of their lecture tonight, which is a very insightful exploration, historical, personal, critical, of Niemeyer's renovated museum in Ibirapuera, is provokingly entitled, and I invite you, if he doesn't tell us, to think about it because it is a truly multivalent title. Niemeyer Doomed, Remembers of Plains Past. So Professor Comas and Almeida, the floor is yours, or the air rather is yours.
Thank you for your presentation. Let me see, advanced portion of screen. May share. Okay. View. Come on. Sorry. Aqui saco. Okay. Hello, everybody. Good day, everybody. And let's begin. Initially meant to be a planetarium, Rio-born Oscar Niemeyer domed building at the Ibirapuera Park in São Paulo, Brazil, was dedicated in 1954 when the city celebrated its 400 years. It was one of four exhibition pavilions, like the neighboring Palace of the Industries, later the venue for the São Paulo Art and Architecture Biennials. And then the building sheltered a museum of aeronautics, and it stood in the park as an artificial hill, not unlike the flying saucer in a sci-fi movie. Photos in Mainlin's catalog suggested connections with constructivism and Bertolt Lubetkin's Zoo Pavilion in London, well known in Rio. The plans show a circular ground floor slab featuring two cutouts which reveal the basement floor, one in the shape of a lens and the other in the shape of a cannon bullet. Above ground, concentric, hexagonal, and quadrangular floor slabs with inward bending sides appear momentarily as tense membranes. Actually, a hairline separates their cantilevered borders from the dome. At right angles to the entrance, the axially disposed horseshoe ramp flanks the obus-shaped cutout, crosses the symmetrically pierced hexagon, and rises fully visible, bisecting one of the quadrangle's long arcs. Escalators, front desk, and ramp triangulate around the center. Niemeyer plays with structures within structures, like Russian dolls or glass paperweights encasing objects. An 80-meter diameter concrete retaining ring defines the basement mount-like from the outside. The dome shelter slabs on a skeletal frame delineating a ziggurat or a mesa. The rooftop terrace or summit under the sky contrasts with the cellar or cave-like basement. Niemeyer had played with the structure within structure partie before, and with ramps too, both curvilinear and straight. Ramps were good for World's Fair visitors, gamblers, and penguins, no doubt, but for art, we had to visit. And that was 1995. Vintage airplanes nicely filled the cutouts and the 5 meters from floor to ceiling. We admired the beveled edges of the floor slabs, but we were not expecting so much symmetry. Our fault, we had not read the plan properly. For between entrance door, ramp, and escalator, there it was, a straightforward alley of columns anchoring all the peripheral visual excitement, all those lenses and eyelid-like portholes that relate vision to exhibition. Floor slabs slice space like curved blades, sights to be precise. Niemeyer balanced centrifugal and centripetal impulses, accommodate the archetype of directional space within the archetype of radiant space, and inverted the biennial pavilion situation, where Alice were the norm and the curvilinear cutout was the exception, the memorable anchor. Guarini was also recalled in positive, so to say, art is religion. A pillow-like figure signaled rest when one reached the stairway top and understood that the echo of the Mediterranean temple, the colonnade, here meets the echo of the Mesopotamian ziggurat, the overlapping floor slabs. As Niemeyer is turning Schinkel inside out, we are reminded that architecture does not dispense with memory. Precedence is the springboard for intention. Like every first-rate artist, Niemeyer is a cannibal. Disciplinary culture is a design tool, and what is good for penguins is also good for featherless bipeds. A few years later, Paulo Mendes da Rocha and MMBB remodeled and updated the building to accommodate blockbusters exhibitions. Similar uses changed context. It reopened in 2000, renamed Oka for its resemblance to a native Indian hut. We desperately wanted to love it, but somehow the magic was gone. The new front desk prevented the access to the central alley and muted the dialogue with the biennial pavilion. The limpid planarity was gone, was forgotten. Limpid in this context means free from anything that darkens, and the acceptance of material hybridity rather than homogeneity to showcase elementary forms. The efforts undertaken by Niemeyer to reconsider the Pochet idea were put aside. Services would no longer be integrated materially and spatially into architectural form. Horizontal planes were clouded by ducts and tracks. Columns were beheaded. This is a first-rate retrofit, and plans reveal that much care was invested in the design of ducts and tracks, cables and wires. All the mantras in the preservation book are respected. The operation is reversible, although it may remain on view for ages. The legibility of different moments in the building's history is not blurred, which is rather the historian's problem than the architects or the public's. There are no stars in the sky anymore. However, the price of whitewashing is pollution, loss of integrity, and disfiguration of both ceilings, the underside of floors, and the ground floor alley. Is this autonomy of ducts and tracks as well as cables and wires a question of truth? We doubt it. It's a type of a formal solution that has much to commend it pragmatically. But we cannot help thinking that is also the result of a late brutalist attitude very much alive in contemporary Brazilian modern architecture, confronting the post-purist approach of vintage Brazilian modern architecture, for which thinness and lightness and minimalism and geometrical abstraction were still desiderata. And we cannot help regretting that as far as architecture is both an extension of and a metaphor for the human body, the remodeled ochre reminds us of a sick body, that of someone who, unable to take food by mouth, underwent gastrostomy and exposed the tubes needed for enteral feeding. As body metaphors go, we kept seeing ochre as a person whose artificial leg could be hidden from public view and preserve decorum that outmoded war, but was in urgent need of a change. They do not last long, artificial legs. So that person got a crutch, a brand new, well-designed crutch, but still a crutch. Granted, ochre's misfortune was nowhere as great as that of Niemeyer's dance hall at Pampulha, where the restaurant was disfigured by a drop-at ceiling and lighting worthy of the gaudiest or decor lobby in a restoration apparently endorsed by Niemeyer himself. Nothing against exposed ducts when they suggest a virtual hollowed-out slab and do not compete with round columns. Now, to conclude, a work of architecture exists in time and space. Synonymous with judgment, criticism of a work of architecture in different moments may vary because of the work's changed aspects rather than the critic's changed views. Criticism always mirrors the critic's cultural baggage. Criticism is based on knowledge, as we cannot and should not judge something we do not know. Ideally, first-hand knowledge, which involves research, reasoning, imagining. To paraphrase Ortega y Gasset, a work of architecture is itself and its circumstances. Architectural criticism implies description before judgment to better understand the building, and then the organization of rational and emotional experience into words to better communicate the personal experience of it to others and to better compare that personal experience with their experiences. Requiring data and taking time, always dated and never the worse for it, imbued with evocative power, criticism has some measure of restorative power, as it may both suggest and guide the renewal of monuments that are also documents and have to work as equipments, not being allowed to be museums of themselves. For if every work of architecture relies upon previous work, every architect is an architectural critic when looking for previous work that may be relevant to the design problem at hand. An architect remodeling an existing building cannot help evaluating it. And architects and preservation agencies cannot help doing architectural criticism, both when deciding if a building is worth listing and when approving work in unlisted buildings. Could our experience of horizontal planes slicing space like blades have influenced Oka's remodeling, were it available to them, to the designers, as well as the reviewers? Hard to know. Consensus is an elusive goal, the more so when dealing with modern architecture, whose practitioners and theoreticians had and have not only diverse ideas over time about firmness, about utility, about delight, but also about the weight that should be conferred to each of it, not to mention the role of often overlooked cost-benefit analysis. If ever so slightly, judgments are likely to differ from practitioner to practitioner, critic to critic, practitioner to critic. Yes, good criticism matters. Who said it was easy? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Comas, you and Almeida for this paper. Louise, if you are present.
Yes, here I am.
Do you want to take the questions for it? Shall I do it? How do you want to proceed?
I can take the questions and you do the next one.
I do the next one. Fine, as we said. Yes, please.
Yes. The thing is, Carlos, if you can stop sharing your...
Yes.
So we can see more, have a panorama of the part of the present attendance. I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation, and I really liked what you said about first-hand knowledge in order to approach criticism of a place. I think you did that. You did that by visiting the place, and you did that by studying both Niemeyer, as we could see in your presentation, and the approach of Méndez da Rocha. But can you add a little bit on the last part that you said, that remodeling is also criticism?
Well, criticism etymologically comes from the Greek kritein, which is to judge, to evaluate. If you are going to remodel, you have to know it. And if knowledge is in a way, you have to assess the qualities and the shortcomings of what you have at hand. So what I mean, actually, I think that there is a kind of, in our culture, there seems to be a kind of unfortunate split between architecture as someone who designs and who does things, and the critic as someone who speaks about things. But I'm saying that actually, you know, the architect is always a critic. He can't help not being a critic when he works as an architect. And in a way, critics using words are also influencing works of architecture, you know. So the reviewer or the member of the jury that Professor Cheng told us about who is pointing to this or that feature and say that it has to be changed, and he is acting as an architect also. So I think that we have to have a broader vision of both, you know, not as different personality, but let's say as different clothes of the same person.
Very interesting. Thank you, Carlos Eduardo Comas. And I have several congratulations from Fernando Diez, Nivaldo de Andrade, and also some questions like the one by Rashmi Gajare that says, when you say critics should have first-hand knowledge, do you mean they should be architects themselves?
Well, not necessarily. We have, I like to mend a saying that we have in Portuguese. We say in Portuguese that poeta e louco, todo mundo tem pouco. That means that everybody has something of a poet and of a madman. So I would add architect from that to that list, you know, and I would say that of architect, poet, and madman, everybody has a bit. Okay, so I mean, architect, you know, my definition of architect as compared to a layman is someone on whom society has bestowed the task of knowing more or having a more specialized knowledge. But this is a difference. This is a difference in extension. It's not a difference in kind, if you know what I mean.
Yes, thank you. I think it was really explicit. And also there are congratulations from Ruth Verdezein, from many other, Marta Peixoto. You have a big, many people that really like your presentations. There's a longer question by Robert MacArthur, but I think I'll give first the floor before reading it to Wilfred Wang that already put his hand up. Wilfred.
Thank you, Louise, and thank you, Carlos and Marcos for your joint work. What I appreciate most is the fact that you acknowledge the necessity for research in both cases. And architects need to research the context in which they're working. They need to understand, in the case of preservation work, the history of the building, the intentions that the architects pursued, and so on. So knowledge is a foundation for being able to make a judgment. But there are limitations that both architects and critics have in their own ways. Some architectural critics are not trained as architects, and so sometimes they allow their personal preferences to cloud their judgment. And similarly, some architects are terrible researchers, and so they allow their ignorance to cloud their imagination. And so in both cases, you've got limitations, right? And I think what you're saying is that there is no escaping from the fact that we need to both, as critics, be aware of the options and to be broad enough to understand that there are options and not to allow our preferences to cloud our judgments. And similarly for architects to be able to do their homework before they start sketching.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
And in that same sense, thank you, Wilfred. In that same sense, Robert MacArthur says, excellent presentation, also very relevant to recent renovations and additions to the Kimball Museum and the Carpeted Center, and other examples by star architects who seem to take too little time to know the buildings that they were asked to renovate. So it's exactly what you were both saying. It takes really an interest into learning about the building you're going to renovate and to change, or at least do some changes, it takes a lot of study into it.
But Louise, you know, there is a jungle out there, and we don't usually like to talk about this aspect, but you know, there is fight in the architectural scene, and there is competition, and there are egos, and there are, you know, covetable rewards. So it's hard.
Yes, I know. There's another comment by Alexandra Staub that says, I have found that when critics are trained as architects, they have very different view of the building. For example, they understand the structural or mechanical system in a way non-architects often do not. Thoughts on this?
Well, I think that one thought that could, I agree, but I would say that I used the word description in the last paragraph of the paper. And it's this thing because people can be, can agree about the proper description of a form and yet evaluate it very differently. I would say that for me, the most telling example is about the Ministry of Education building in Rio de Janeiro, which is, I think that everybody more or less knows about it. But anyway, the superstructure of the building has the water towers deliberately designed as ship chimneys, and also the restaurants that are more or less like the cabin, you know. So there's no doubt that it's a figurative reference to the metaphor of the building as a ship. And then the newspapers, then we're talking about 1942, and this was the Pearl Harbor attack on the United States. And then newspapers started to call the building, which was still in construction, as Capanema Maru. Capanema being the name of the minister who had commissioned the work, and Maru as sheep. So for his admirers, for the admirers of the building of Capanema and the architects, the ministry where the building was the ship that was propelling Brazil to a new stage in her history. While for the detractors, it was the ship that was going to sink the finances of the state because of its costliness. So in a way, both parties agreed with what they were seeing, but evaluation was very different, and so was criticism in that sense.
Thank you, Carlos Eduardo Comas. I think it's been a very interesting, also a bit provocative presentation, and that's what we expected. And we will now go on to our next presenter of the morning, Martin Hartung. We can keep talking about this in the last half hour of the roundtable. So if you have more thoughts, keep your thoughts. Martin Hartung is an art historian, and since 2014, a doctoral candidate at the Institute of History and Theory of Architecture at ETH Zurich, where his research focused on the institutional history of architectural-related art gallery exhibitions over the course of the 20th century in relation to global changes in the architectural profession. Thus, it is very much related to the theme of today, high culture, and the line we're following that has to do with museums. You have the floor.
Thank you,
Martin.
Louise, and also to Elias and the other organizers. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Perfect. So the elaborate expansion project of the Museum of Modern Art, also known as MoMA, in Midtown Manhattan, which first moved into its own institutional home in 1939, 10 years after its foundation, have attracted a variety of critics. The latest edition by Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro, completed in 2019 in collaboration with Gensler, was no exception. Its smaller neighbor, the American Folk Art Museum, designed by Todd Williams and Billy Chen, which opened in 2001, was already demolished 13 years later to make room for MoMA. It caused a large controversy in New York in light of MoMA's prominent role in the enculturation of architecture. My talk addresses this case and aims to place it into the context of both the larger expansion projects and developments that took place in the field of architectural criticism over the past 40 years. To place MoMA in the center of these debates appears fertile, given the role the institution has played in shaping architecture culture, but also because MoMA's expansion projects, the last two of which have cost well over $1 billion between 1997 and 2019, received constant coverage by architecture, art, and culture critics, both positive and negative, which allows us to take a closer look at the reaction of some critics with a focus on the United States. While MoMA as a cultural forerunner and tastemaker established the first department of architecture in any museum, first programmed and funded by Philip Johnson in 1932, the museum frequently left many critics and the lay public puzzled by the directions its major expansions took since the late 1970s. From the outset, the museum has drawn a variety of critics as well as supporters. In 1977, the architect and critic Peter Blake, who was both after his short tenure as an architecture curator at the museum in the late 1940s, delivered a talk at the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies in New York about what he termed the failure of architectural criticism. He pointed out the power forces behind publicizing building culture and made MoMA partially responsible for a crisis in architectural criticism, as the institution had promoted architecture to a lay public and professionals alike as an art form, rather than properly acknowledging its economic, sociological, technological, and political concerns. The title of my presentation, The New MoMA, is borrowed from Paul Goldberger's coverage of the first major expansion project by the museum in the New York Times since 1979. It was designed by Cesar Pelli and Associates between 1977 and 1984 and followed several additions and renovations by Johnson. Explicitly tasked with a real estate development project, Pelli was commissioned in 1977 to significantly expand the museum's gallery spaces, including the addition of a 52-story apartment tower known as the Museum Tower, which produced income for the private institution through controversial tax benefits. The most debated feature of Pelli's museum design, however, materialized in a glass structure with escalators, then called the Garden Hall, that maximized visitor circulation and city views, but minimized the space in Johnson's praised Abbey Aldrich Rockefeller Sculpture Garden, and was immediately compared by critics to a shopping center and airport terminal when the museum reopened in 1984. Such a continuous expansional logic seemingly stood in contrast to the, quote, artistic and intellectual inquiry that is especially true of the Museum of Modern Art, end of quote, as its director Glenn Lowry formulated in a publication accompanying the largest $858 million museum expansion project to date, which became the first realized building by Japanese architect Yoshio Taniguchi in the United States and was executed between 1997 and 2004. After a laborious commission process with 10 international architects, including Rem Koolhaas, who famously branded the museum as MoMA Inc., Taniguchi corrected several aspects of the Pelli expansion and proposed a minimalist design of urbanistic scale by unifying the museum campus into a quasi-monolithic complex. The expansion nevertheless created new issues related to scale, especially of a 110-foot high atrium that effectively made great artworks appear like postage stamps or posters, a comparison made by Ada Louise Huxtable in 2006, 2 years after the reopening. Huxtable by then wrote for the Wall Street Journal after she had become the first full-time architecture critic at a daily newspaper in the United States in 1963 at the New York Times. Like Blake, Huxtable also had a past in the Department of Architecture at MoMA. As it turned out, the Taniguchi expansion added to rather than solved visitor congestion. Referring to the atrium in 2005, critics to St. Stephen's commented for Architectural Record, I quote her, "Still, it makes a great party hall," adding that the building was, quote, "too subtle to be sexy," and that all it needed was a spa. The Taniguchi building was first generally welcomed by critics, while the corporate background and character of the structure remained a constant point of criticism. Not even 10 years later, in 2013, the New York-based firm Diez, Scofidio and Renfro, DS&R, was hired by the museum to fix the institution's issues related to continuous growth after the Taniguchi expansion had already increased the visitor capacity to well over 3 million per year. Known for other museum buildings, successful adaptive reuse projects, the firm's both productive and subtle institutional criticism was as well as its long-standing ties to the art world, were welcomed by the museum. At the same time, DS&R respected their clients' wishes and focused on internal changes, including the rearrangement of the museum's collection with eyes on its general cultural mission in a global context that MoMA's chief curators had identified who were crucial in the expansion planning. In 2014, Diez stated among the major goals of the $450 million expansion project to enlarge exhibition spaces for MoMA's collection. They were increased by 30% to now 175,000 square meters. Other goals were to create flexible multidisciplinary galleries to enhance the visitor experience, including an improvement of the circulation, and to, quote Diller, provide a strong interface with the city. This was, among others, attempted with a large cantilevered canopy that now clearly signifies the museum's main entrance on 53rd Street. In conjunction with a larger lobby, a sunken retail store, more immediate access to artworks, and the reconstructed Bauhaus staircase of 1939, the most visible addition by DS&R was what the firm refers to as the Blade Stair, a refined construction that connects the Taniguchi building with new gallery spaces in an apartment tower designed by Jean Nouvel. Erected adjacent to MoMA, the museum had sold the lot and related air rights to its developer Heinz in 2007. With Heinz, the museum had a longer history, especially through Johnson. The American Folk Art Museum once stood between MoMA and the Nouvel Design Tower, in which the museum had secured 3 floors for new gallery spaces. In 2011, MoMA purchased the American Folk Art Museum, a move the smaller institution had to make to pay off its debts. At the time, as some critics and also the architects feared, the deal had already sealed the fate of the Folk Art Museum, as it quite simply stood in the way of MoMA's westward expansion. The New York Times art and architecture critic Michael Kimmelman accordingly likened it with the museum's manifest destiny, thereby referring to the 19th century American ideology of a ruthless national expansion. The verticality of the Blade Stair, placed behind a glazed facade on the side of the former American Folk Art Museum, prompted the contributing editor to Architect magazine, Carrie Jacobs, to describe it as, quote, a subliminal eulogy to the Folk Art Museum, which famously was designed so that its stairway doubled as galleries. However, the transparent facade now stands in stark contrast to the crafted alloyed bronze panels New York Times critic Herbert Mouchon had originally linked to, and I quote him, the 19th century philosophy to truth to materials in a building, again, Mouchon, with an atrium of domestic proportions, end of quote, and an intimacy that is long mourned to have been lost at MoMA. In 2013, when MoMA first announced its decision to demolish the building, it already led to bad publicity. Following a request of the architecture firm to review the decision as a condition to accept the commission, MoMA gave DS&R time to find a suitable solution. However, none was found in the process, and the architects ultimately came to the same conclusion as their client. As the main reasons, Diller listed mismatching floor plates between the buildings, problems with visitor circulation, as well as the Folk Art Museum's narrow and horizontal layout. The architect frequently referred to the conclusion as painful in light of their respect for the work of Williams and Chen, who had also taken part in the selection process of MoMA's 1997 expansion project, the same year in which the firm was commissioned to design the American Folk Art Museum. The large wave of criticism associated with the building's demolition only came after the final announcement was made. Although buildings had been demolished before in the service of MoMA's expansions, as well as in the process of constructing the American Folk Art Museum itself, never before had MoMA spearheaded the destruction of a building by another cultural institution, even though the museum owned it by then. To a comment Paul Goldberger made that, quote, art isn't always a rational matter. Sometimes architecture isn't either. The MoMA director effectively could only reply, and I quote him, "We don't collect buildings." To complicate matters, the design of the American Folk Art Museum itself was not unchallenged. Diller even referred to the idiosyncratic building as obdurate. The building was clearly favored as a small architectural gem, a personal symbol, and placed in opposition to the much larger and powerful Museum of Modern Art that was likened by one New York museum official with a, quote, 800-pound gorilla. At an unusual public forum, co-hosted by the Architectural League and presented at the New York Society for Ethical Culture in late January 2014, where MoMA officials and the architect were joined by critics and professionals to come to terms with the ultimate decision to destroy the Folk Art Museum. The participants reminded everyone present that the building, when it opened shortly after the 9/11 terror attacks in New York, stood as a sign of hope for new beginnings in the city. The many critical voices at the panel itself may have prompted the decision by MoMA to preserve the specially crafted facade of the Folk Art Museum, which is since placed in storage. It's unseen, whereas the remainder of the building did not survive. Architect Stephen Rusto, also attending the panel in 2014 and familiar with MoMA as an institution since his involvement in the Taniguchi expansion, summarized the case most poignantly. He acknowledged that the Folk Art Museum, quote, was a mixed achievement with beautifully crafted moments, but also cramped and clumsy ones, which briefly fulfilled its original program and then became a kind of lavish ruin, end of quote. Also noted misguided statements and lost conversations about the possibilities of preserving the building, the relationship between private properties and civic opportunities, and ecological implications related to the destruction and replacement of a building after such a short time. He asked, quote, were we really expected to believe that MoMA was incapable of turning a museum into a museum? This pointed to the objectives of the client rather than the options of the architects. Rusto also argued that making the Folk Art Museum straight away into a, quote, untouchable masterpiece, as almost every critic had done, further complicated the issue and led to missed opportunities. From his point of view, bold comparisons such as one made by long-term architecture critic Martin Filler by comparing the demolition with that of Pennsylvania Station half a century before eventually did a service to the purpose of saving the small museum, even though it was attempted. Generally well received, Diez and R's expansion was described as, quote, refined and tactical, and elsewhere evaluated by equally long-term architecture critic Joseph Giovannini as a, quote, success. However, not a foregone conclusion, given that MoMA is conservative architecturally and is budget sensitive as the developers who have steered its building committees. The focus of the critical coverage of the major MoMA expansions from the late 1970s to the early 2000s appears to have gradually placed more attention on their context, including the decisions of their director and the board of trustees as the clients, than on the complexity of the work of the involved architects. Whereas in 2004, many contributions about the Taniguchi expansion came from scholars. Between 2014 and 2020, coverage was offered by a more diverse group of writers in a varied media landscape that generally offered more image-heavy reviews than long-form architectural criticism. In addition, many more voices had been raised on the destruction of the American Folk Art Museum in 2014 than on the completed expansion in 2019. How could the critics respond to a surgical expansion, as Diller referred to it? After all, the case of the American Folk Art Museum had proven to be much more personal and also presented a much more tangible topic in the context of publicity. Furthermore, what could critics have done to save the building if already the commissioned architects were not able to find a solution? To that, one panelist argued in 2014 that there was hardly a chance to save the Folk Art Museum in the expansion plan if a continuous circulation remained the client's major goal. Did the resulting subtler and not sweeping expansion by Diez and R prompt architecture critics to comment on it rather than to critique it? Urban designer Miriam Gusevich asserted in the early 90s that, quote, criticism is riskier than commentary. It is willing to judge and to condemn, to stake out and substantiate a particular position, and that by conferring judgment, criticism exercises power, adding that, quote, this power works indirectly by effectively establishing the canon, and it works directly by making and undoing reputations. In 2015, Goldberger highly doubted the power of architecture critics, but rather assigned authority to them, with a general ability to make people more aware of and literate about the built environment none of us are able to escape from. While critics used to control the relationship between the profession of architecture and the world, he stated in 2015 that neither architects nor their critics can, quote, change the world. Michael Sorkin, an architect and fierce critic who passed away last year, was less cautious in 2014 and still fought around the same time against a, quote, architecture of neoliberalism, driven by a market to which it offers not the slightest resistance. At a time when Diez and R were focused on a new building design for the site where the American Folk Art Museum had just been torn down, he addressed both architects and critics by demanding, and I quote him, our job is not to adjudicate nitpicking questions of academic status, but to help save the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. If you could also unshare the screen. Thank you. It was a very thorough examination of the literature surrounding these changes in architectural criticism from 1979 to recently, 2019. And I know you are a historian, and your paper is very well documented. It would be interesting to know, however, that having gone through this review of literature, how you stand as a critic, or what the effects were of criticism on the demolition of the American Folk Art Museum and the expansion, and based on what grounds. I will just remind two terms that Carlos Comas mentioned before. We start with a description, which is common to all, and then evaluation comes. So the description is not simply a commentary. It's quite essential to what we're talking about. And I think in order to go to the questions and you can answer more fully, there is an interestingly phrased question by Robert MacArthur, which says, at the public discussion, Karen Stein, Pritzker Prize juror at that time, asked the MoMA and DSR, is in fact the Folk Art Museum section had not been shown to be able to be incorporated into the connection to the Nouvelle Tower, and MoMA and DSR admitted this was true, so their primary argument for distraction was false. So here is a question that starts with the facts, doubting the facts. So maybe we can start with this.
Yeah, it's probably, the question is more what wasn't said, especially by the client, the MoMA, the owner of the building. First of all, at the panel, and this was very, very important, the panel started at the time with the question, why should the public have a say in this decision at all? Because the museum was owned by a private institution who had every right, at least legally, to alter the building or demolish it in that case. And one of the major remarks at the time why the public had a say is, of course, that MoMA as a cultural institution, an important one as such, is part of a city with shared experiences and shared spaces. So the idea to, Karen Stein was very right in saying at the time, to, first of all, refer to MoMA's role as a cultural institution in this process of decision-making, but also in saying that if you place so much, emphasis on the perfect circulation of people, just moving people around in a cultural institution that is growing larger and larger, then you, of course, cannot make many other decisions than to destroy the building. Other people were still not convinced, and I'm neither until this date. It's been 7 years until this panel convened in New York, that the building couldn't have been saved, and certainly more than the facade that is placed on storage and is not of use for anyone at the moment. There were several other aspects that weren't discussed of preservation, like how you can preserve a building and on what grounds.
Okay, to carry on with the questions, but just on your last phrase, that indeed the building so far as you discussed it was mainly about the facade, but not also as a functioning exhibition space. You did say something about it being crammed, but I will carry on with the questions. There are some questions by Wolf recurring, a conversation that started before. I think we should leave this for the end because they started with Comas and Almeida's presentation. Sengul also, who refers to the legacy for the previous presentation to Ada Louise Huxtable. Now she's reminded of Michael Sorkin. I will go to Fernando Diez, whose comment is quite potent. Fernando Diez says, a literal demonstration of avant-gardism burying tradition, folklore being its humblest but most genuine expression. MoMA expansionism is also the metaphor of industrialism, burying the planet under CO2 emissions. I mean, MoMA sensibility is clearly outdated. Would you like to comment on that?
Well, I think I was trying to make that clear in my paper by positioning these two different aspects. And also by ending with Sorkin and the notion that critics, to at least at the same time when the building was demolished, the Fogart Museum, critics had a responsibility to also, and this is specifically Sorkin, but others as well, of course, to respond to neoliberal forces in architecture and to request, and this is also implicit by the critic, who's also an architect in Sorkin's case, how you can actually act in this environment. How can you really have an impact as a critic and an architect in these cases? And I think it refers also to the keynote lecture that we just heard about the comment rather than the critic, and who is responsible for what, or who can be made responsible for what.
Okay, I think for me at least the question remains somehow unanswered. How do you focus on this problem? I see, let me see if there is another question. I think there is another one by Robert, but Wilfred Wang has risen his hand. So Wilf, until I read the other question, would you please comment?
Yes, I think this presentation reminds me a little bit of a very well-researched, very carefully put together and assembled documentation that allows, that seemingly does not take a line, but allows other voices to make the argument. So it's a little bit like, you know, taking you back to theater, where the director is sort of, you know, playing around with the characters and is sort of foregrounding or backgrounding certain topics. I think what Elias is saying is that it's essential that you ought to take a more direct line in this context of this conference. If you're if you're an architectural historian, that's fine, but in the context of a conference on criticism, it would be helpful to be more explicit in your evaluation, right? So this is my recommendation, and I just make the concluding remark that the aesthetic, you know, Dilla, Scofidi, Renfro were the darlings of the 1980s and 90s. They were the kind of outsiders. Now they've become really mainstream corporate designers. And this corporate aesthetic perfectly fits the corporate ethics of the Museum of Modern Art. So these things go hand in hand. And of course, folk art has no role in the corporate world. It just has to be.
Thank you, Wilfred.
That I said that.
Robert has focused even further on the argument, and I see his hand. Robert, would you like me to read the question or just?
Yeah, no, I can read the question because actually I'd like to follow up. I think Wilfred just put his finger on the key thing. Thank you, Martin, for a very interesting presentation. I do also think that hopefully your paper will probe a little further into some of the specifics, because it is an amazing kind of cultural clash between the Folk Art Museum, which was very intentionally designed to be an intimate experience due to the scale and the delicate or sort of ephemeral quality of many of its works, which should not be called artworks, in fact, arguably because they are a sort of folk production. And so it was a challenging commission also in terms of being able to actually make a building of any sort in New York for such art, which is the cause of the economic issues that came up. But the sort of evaluation of it theoretically that happened by Dello Scofidio, which in fact Karen Stein sort of torpedoed that whole as if that whole sort of sham argument that, oh, we did look and we thought we could somehow fit it into the Museum of Modern Art. They can't, because in fact, it's designed for a completely different experience. And the idea at one point floated to make it into the art and architecture sort of gallery for the Museum of Modern Art, which it would have technically worked in terms of scale and of galleries and vertical spaces and such, was sort of beside the point. I believe it comes down to an issue of appropriateness of both the criticism and also the action that was taken. And the Museum of Modern Art behaved in an entirely inappropriate manner. And Dello Scofidio were complicit in that. I happen to know that this has led to the complete severance of relationships between DSR and Todd Williams and Billy Chen. There's no more communication. I would also, on a personal note, say that as a result of the destruction of the Folk Art Museum, I have never and will never set foot in the Museum of Modern Art again. So we have to sort of walk with our feet.
Robert, this was very interesting. I can send you my photographs of the Folk Art Museum many years ago when the guards were chasing me around and I had to secretly take photographs. That's a remembrance. But I think we have 3 more minutes that ask questions about or talk about the present and the future of MoMA. I will just read them, and if there is any reaction from Martin, I think we'll close with that. The first one is by Rashmi Gajare. The MoMA expansion has also greatly changed the experience of the visitors. The space on my last visit felt disorienting. Although I have been a regular visitor, I kept getting lost, not knowing how to plan my itinerary. The other one is by Alexandra Staub. Martin, thank you for your talk. One question: where is MoMA going with their expansion? At what point is MoMA no longer MoMA as we once knew and loved it? And the last one is by Jasna Gallier. How does new MoMA correspond to the exhibition representing architecture in this museum? So if Martin or somebody else would like to comment on that, and we'll conclude.
The MoMA that we loved is always a difficult, and that's why I also was very cautious, being too much of a critic myself, although the way I placed the talk was the criticism that I applied. And Wilfried is absolutely right. But the focus of this talk was also the reaction by architecture critics, which we should, I think, in this conference talk more about. They barely get featured so far. And to place them in such a long timeline is not so easy. At the same time, we can see when we look at the Pelly expansion that this intimacy was lost then, and this is not news. This has been stated over and over again. The interesting fact about the American Folk Art Museum, and it is true, of course, that the content and programs of these 2 institutions didn't align, was, and I say that again, what wasn't talked about in this discussion. And of course, MoMA is expanding all the time, and I have no idea where they can still go. There has, since the Taniguchi expansion, been the idea of moving the museum from Midtown into a completely different area, which they have partially done at the time in Queens. But to remain at Midtown in Manhattan, which was once a brownstone neighborhood, small scale, and is now increasingly homogene and with large towers. Of course, also places them an cultural institution in a huge, melting pot of issues. That if they want to survive there, and this is the decision, I guess, that is, on the basis of all of this, they have to play by the rules of the developers, which are partially also part of their board of trustees.
I think then the answer will be given by an architectural comics by Schuit and Peters, The Fever of Urbicand. That tells you there are no limits to this expansion. So
it looks like it.
Yeah. So I think I have not missed any questions. No hands raised. There is a last one. So this is last minute. I'll just read this one from Jurnaganant Balsavar. Intriguing presentation, an opportunity lost opens a new discourse if modern art were to be observed in a broader perspective, where Picasso and the others went back to the origins and the primal, which referenced the folk as well. It could have opened a liminal and complex threshold between the primal folk and modern art. Just a thought. So thank you, Balsavar. Deduction by Sengul. Whether we like them or not, we should not change the position of some, like Philip Johnson. You open another discussion, Sengul.
You can see we can have
I know what you're talking about. Leave it for the end. So Wilfred, we have a 10-minute break now. Okay. We'll see you at 6:20. Is that correct? Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Hello, Anna. You're mute. You are mute. I can't hear you, Anna.
Sorry. Today it's not my day to talk. I was just saying that the Durganath point is very interesting.
Yeah, I just read that. But I think from the point of view of Docomomo, there is a lot of interesting stuff for you here regarding MoMA for the discussion.
Indeed.
Isn't there?
Because we always have the idea that MoMA, you know, it's the tabula rasa, but
yeah, it's the seal of approval for design. Anything that goes there.
Yes, and MoMA is the great responsible for this idea that there's one modern movement.
Yeah, exactly.
Since the international style, so it's completely wrong, and with our countries, this doesn't fit at all.
It's very one-sided, and that's what Docomomo has, in a way, disproved or expanded.
Yes, I tried to open it in other, not the Eurocentric directions at all.
I've seen. Because I have the volumes next to me.
Yes,
we talk about it.
You can see all the journals from the last 12 years, and we, and thanks to Louise too, she has been very helpful in the scientific board of the journal. And in fact, it's amazing to realize how folk and how the popular and the vernacular, all these connections
can be interweaved.
Yes, in 2 weeks we are going to have a conference in our school on Rudowski, and it's, you know, it's a girl from Sevilla, Mar Loren. She made a very good exhibition with Rudowski and all of this.
Let's talk about it in the end. We have to start, I think. Yes, Wilfred?
Yes.
Okay.
But now we have a very fantastic presentation.
Yes, we do, indeed. So today Porto Alegre is on the forefront.
Yes.
The school and the people who work there.
Claudia, I'm here with you.
And there is a fan club.
Hello, Anna. How are you?
No, now I disappear.
After Carlos Comas and Marcos Almeida's presentation, there is the interesting one we have now by Claudia Costa Cabral. And just as a parenthesis, I found out that in MASP, which we'll hear about in a minute, there are paintings by an Almeida Jr. So,
yeah.
So
bye-bye. I disappear now. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you. Claudia Costa Cabral, for those of us who didn't know her before, is an architect, graduate of the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, and holds a PhD from the Escuela Técnica Superior de Arquitectura de Barcelona. She's full professor of the Faculty of Architecture, Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, and a researcher of the National Council of Scientific and Technological Development of Brazil. Her research focuses on modern and contemporary architecture in Latin America and on the relationship between architectural, culture, art, and technology. The subject of her lecture, which I found particularly fascinating, is an exploration of the seminal Museum of Arts in Sao Paulo, MASP, through representations. And that is why it is entitled On Lina Bobardi's Iconography, 3 Drawings. So, Claudia, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Elias. Here it goes. A Brazilian art critic once said that critics were mostly people who confused a flashlight with a lighthouse and stayed lost. The images of the lighthouse and the flashlight can be related to what should be the general purpose of criticism, to shed light on existing things. But they address 2 opposing models for architectural criticism as an intellectual activity. The lighthouse stands for an idea of criticism grounded on the commitment, either ethical or aesthetical to show the safe and true route for an audience presumably in need of guidance. The flashlight is a hand-scale tool more suitable to illuminate specific angles. This presentation is about Lina Bobardi's Museum of Art in São Paulo, and it uses the flashlight. I will examine these 3 drawings of the MASP's Belvedere by Lina Bobardi, expecting to uncover aspects that may have remained unseen under the bright, but also homogenizing halo of the lighthouse. 2 of the drawings are taken from the same point of view, with the observer placed under the building's free span. The ground level plaza is a central feature of MASP's project. Lina split the building into 2 independent bodies. Using the side slope, a half-buried basement comprises the museum complementary equipments, generating a flat terrace. The major rooms for the collection and temporary exhibitions are housed in a volume suspended above the plaza. Lina always said that the Belvedere had to be column-free due to municipal restrictions on the site. However, it's more likely that the idea of a fully unobstructed ground-level plaza had asserted itself during the process of design. Early sketches display a solution closer to Lina's former seaside museum in São Vicente and to Redes MAM in Rio, with a rectangular volume raised on a supporting structure formed by transversal concrete porticos. A further drawing shows that Lina rotated the porticos and reduced them to 2, but the plaza remained occupied by a compact nucleus of streets of lifts and stairs and by an expansive helicoidal staircase. The final solution appears in this quick pen sketch. A bridge-like structure covers a space that has been entirely swept of obstacles. The helicoidal staircases are replaced by the unassuming orthogonal stairs and single lift receded to the far end of the span. With this move, Lina downplayed the connection between levels and increased the significance of the span. It's not an open-air hall, a subsidiary space for the architectural experience of the above museum. It stands for itself. The first drawing is taken from the same viewpoint, the fixed Renaissance viewpoint, and the placing of Alberti's Linea del Centro near the bottom of the page seems to overstate the ceiling. Emphasizing the gigantic concrete slab, the perspective reinforces the idea of the building as a statement on technical capacity. In fact, the bridge-like structure developed by engineer Figueiredo Ferraz for MASPs was the first architectural use of a pre-stressed structure in São Paulo. MASP's construction coincided with a sensitive change of scale in the city's urban environment. Although the vertical growth expressed by the architecture of high-rise buildings was perhaps more impressive in numbers, Lina's MASP had no parallel as a technical tour de force except in the engineering realm of viaducts and bridges. But Lina's drawing responds to São Paulo's growth fever and to the city's shaping as an asphalt jungle in a double and perhaps ambivalent way. The huge concrete slab is not depicted as a neutral architectural surface. Simultaneously, the building is presented as the result of a technical triumph and as a dark surface hurt by scars and scrolls. This sort of picture inside the picture strategy suggests the interweaving of distinct sensibilities. The inside picture, the asphaltic trapezoidal figure spread over the upper part of the page, may be compared to Jean Dubuffet's sooty landscapes of the 40s, inspired by street graffiti and the idea that life should be offered raw by the artist. Dubuffet was interested in vulgar and unstable materials like mortars and asphalt. Lina's portrayal of her work as tainted by blurs and scratches recalls Dubuffet's engagement on a sort of game of destruction and his acceptance of the accidental, the dirty, and the arbitrary as the truthful representation of a formless and chaotic reality. The allusion to the less bright sides of modernity can also be found in the way she depicts the free space below the concrete slab. At the bottom of the page, she wrote, "L'ombra della sera." It can be literally translated from Italian as the shadow of the evening, but it also refers to the famous small Etruscan statue called Ombra della Sera, representing a nude male with an extremely elongated body, which is frequently associated to Alberto Giacometti's slender sculptures of the post-war period. Despite more recent insistence on masks, big span as a place to be intensely used by people, it looks silent and uninhabited in this drawing, except for the very small human figures at the bottom of the drawing, whose shadows stretch out as the Etruscan little statue or Giacometti's almost evanescent skeletal figures, exposing human fragility. In the second drawing, Lina presents Masp's big span populated with sculptures, seemingly African primitive idols and totemic columns. It can be related to her earlier collages for large-scale exhibitions, as this one for the Ibirapuera Park, a building Comas showed. And here, a collection of drifting things whose position in space, seeming to be independent from architecture, gives the impression of a sort of imaginary landscape made of realistic figures. In this other one, which belongs to the study for the Seaside Museum, objects are placed against homogeneous, neat, flat surfaces. Nature enters the scene just from behind the glass walls. The Masp collage conveys a different strategy on placing objects and a less predictable approach to the relationship between building and nature. The plaza's floor is covered by a geometrical grid which does not match the small-scale texture of the stone pavement executed, as well as in the architectural determined perspectival space of Renaissance painting. The squared pavement has a connective role, building both a sense of depth and a sense of narrative. It convincingly places the smaller figural elements, the people designed by her and the cut and pasted photographs of sculptures, within a unifying scene framed by the larger architectural elements. Compared to her previous asphalt-like view of the span, the roof concrete slab is a brighter surface. Nevertheless, it's not depicted as a neat, smooth surface, but as an already aged one, marked by small crack lines and taken over by vegetation. The powerful suspended slab, whose dimensions are even exaggerated by perspective, is contrasted by an implied atmosphere of ruin and decay, where nature has eventually had its revenge. This furtive presence of vegetation may be related to Lina's former ideas for the Masp facade with precast panels, upon which random spots of vegetation should grow and flourish. She referred to them as epiphytic plants, suggesting a sort of symbiotic, mutable relationship between the building's architecture and nature. The third drawing also belonged to a study for an open-air exhibition, this time with large sculptures meant for children. It's not an eye-level perspective, but an aerial view overlooking the whole architectural ensemble, taken from the Anhangabaú Valley side. The rear facade stretched horizontally against the green mass of the Siqueira Campus Park across the Paulista Avenue is the white background screen for the myriad of little plots taking place over the surface of the terrace in a sunny day, in a happy atmosphere of children's books. The gentle colors, the fine lines, the multifocal composition with multiple scenes portrayed in a single visual field recall young Lina's watercolors and her father, Enrico Bo's narrative paintings. Instead of the dramatic and melancholic tones, overtones of the views from beneath the span, the panoramic view of the museum and the plaza has an optimist aura, but also one that erases the real city. The museum and the Belvedere seems to have been separated from the city by their own small green belt. The sweet vision of a hard building in a hard city, perhaps inspired by Enrico Bo's affinities with magic realism and its commitment to make improbable visions plausible, as Alfred Barr has put it, presents the Belvedere as a sort of urban oasis where the massive volume of the building safeguards the luminous urban square surrounded by greenery and finally overrun by people. Later, Lina would proudly refer to MASP as an ugly building and as a poor architecture, which used minor and humble means. This posterior narrative on MASP would better suit the contemporary assessment of her work, whether as a socially engaged activity than an artistic endeavor, and as so something that could be assumed as a libel against formalism, supposedly in the opposite side of those who had defended architecture as an art, like her contemporaries Oscar Niemeyer and Lúcio Costa did. Instead, Lina's iconography on MASP resists oversimplification. Rather than a lack of interest in formal or aesthetical problems, her drawings might precisely reveal the way in which these issues were being reworked into the cultural and artistic field. In 1970, the American art critic Harold Rosenberg used the expression de-aestheticization to explain the emerging directions in art since the post-war period, which reflected a growing interest in working into the nature itself as a fragment of the real within the real. Rosenberg's samples included Donald Judd's preference for authentic brown dirt instead of artificial brown paint, and the acceptance by other artists of the effects of chemical, biological, physical, or seasonal forces over the original materials, changing or even destroying them. Lina's alleged search for the difficult, ugly, and the accepted incident might well be understood as the awareness of artistic concerns and anxieties following Guillaume Apollinaire's predictions in 1913 that beauty, that monster, is not eternal. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank you, Claudia.
I think Louise has that.
Yes. First of all, I want to thank you to take us with your flashlight to Lina Bobardi's archives and find all those drawings, not only the drawings of the Belvedere, but the other drawings that really shed light, as you said, into Lina's thought and proposals for the MASP. One thing that amazed me is that in all her drawings, there are no neighboring buildings, no city around, only nature. So maybe if you can add upon that and also to have maybe a more critical point of view from you on what Lina wanted to make in the 60s and later on. Thank you.
Louise, it's not thank you for your question. It's not so easy to answer. Perhaps I have to elaborate a little more in because the three drawings, they correspond to different moments. There is as you said, you have already said, talking about that, there is a time question. In the paper, I tried to place the drawings more clearly along the chronology of facts which belong to the MASPs, not just construction, but also the design. I found one thing I found interesting about these drawings. They do not belong to the moment when Lina was conceiving the building. All of them, she did them after the building had been conceived and the building was actually in construction. So I will have to actually, to be honest, I have to think more about you asked me why she did not draw all the buildings around are not portrayed, because I think they belong to the content of the drawings. I think when she draw this asphalt view of MASPs, like almost like the underside of a viaduct or things like that, she is putting São Paulo into the building, I think. And when and in the last one, 68, practical sculptures, children, and the green belt, she is also thinking about São Paulo, because there was an idea of her, which is in a little sketch. I don't know if there is something more about that, but she had thought about making Paulista Avenue go underground in front of the museum. So the Belvedere could be a sort of form a sort of continuous space with the Siqueira Campus Park across the avenue. Perhaps, I think that São Paulo is part of the drawings, but not literally, as you say.
Thank you. I have one question from Burak Atinsk. And he says, is there any record of Bardi acquaintance of particularly connection with Cedric Price's Fun Place of 1962 as a reference of debate that is not oriented to technology, but seeking other aspects of urban commonality? And then I have two other questions, but I will pass the floor to Elias. Do you want to comment on this?
Yes, I do not know if she was familiar with Cedric Price's work. I do not see many connections because, one, I defend that Lina actually acted as an artist. And what I know about Cedric Price, this artistic architecture as an artistic operation is something that seems to be at least undervalued. I do not know.
Yes.
Louise, perhaps mine relates to Altinisic's question, Burak Altinisic's, and on what Claudia just answered, maybe she would carry on. Each one of us brings something to both the images and the words that followed your presentation, this excellent presentation. And what has stuck to my mind is one of the last phrases, which is the difficult ugly. So apart from this question about Cedric Price, to mind also comes the ordinary, which is elevated much later by Venturi, becomes an extraordinary thing, this idea. And whether Lina Bobardi comes very early on the scene for that. And also the whole movement of arte povera, which is a European movement. There is Yannis Kounelis and many other artists. I think you make some reference to that with regards to Latin America and Brazil. So maybe you can say something more about this.
Yes, yes. Well, about arte povera, I think when she asked this question about the ugly, difficult, these things, ugly, difficult, and poor architecture, these words, these expressions are posterior to the drawings and posterior to the mask in operation, posterior to all the reception that the building may have deserved or not. When Lina was doing, until as I know, I don't know, when Lina was doing CICA Pompeia, she wrote about CICA Pompeia, and she said, I hope it will be ugly as MASP was. And the ugly, the beauty is easy, the ugly is difficult. And she make some relationship between, she built some relationship between her architecture on CICA Pompeia and the idea of poor architecture. I think that she must have used the expression knowing about arte povera, because arte povera, of course, it was a name given to a movement of artists by an Italian art critic, Germano Cellan. But this happened in not before 1967. Cellan gave this. I don't think that when she was actually designing and thinking about MASP, and when she was doing these particular drawings, she was thinking about arte povera, even because arte povera has a more radical and political implications that I think Dubuffet and the other sources, I do not know that Lina made this drawing because, I'm not saying that Lina has made this drawing because she saw something by Dubuffet, but I think it's this sensibility of the post-war art and architecture are better connected than Lina Bobardi and arte povera. I think that arte povera, the connection between Lina Bobardi and arte povera better suits the contemporary assessment of Lina Bobardi as the socially engaged Lina Bobardi. But I think the artist Lina Bobardi, I do not think that, at least in MASP, because MASP is not a humble building. São Paulo is not a humble city. I think this kind of ambivalence, it's interesting in Lina as an artist, and sometimes the reception of Lina as also as an architect and as a citizen and as a woman, sometimes these things goes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. I have two persons that raised their hands, but before that, several persons sent congratulations. Of course, Carlos Eduardo Comas, Ruth Verdesein, Marta Peixoto, Ana Carolina Pellegrini. But Carlos Eduardo Comas said if you can comment on the structural, the span structurally perverse in her account of the need of such a span at outright fabrication. That's the question from Comas. That, and you have explained it also, the difficulty to have that huge span. And Ruth Verde says, since nowadays everybody in the world think that they are familiar with Lina Bobardi, actually what is being disseminated is just some very limited interpretations repeated ad nauseam. And I agree totally with Ruth Verde. There is so much more to understand that current complications about her work. And that's why, like you said, a flashlight was needed. If you want to comment into that, or you want to hear other, Claudia?
See, perhaps I would like to, it is better to hear other questions. And
okay, can we have your input, Costas Tsiambos, please?
Yes, okay, thank you. My question kind of relates to Elias' comment, and I see also something relevant by Eduardo Comas about the ugly. So it is my impression that there are two kinds of ugliness in the things that we saw. One thing is the building itself as it was built, the brutalism of its construction, the building in its environment, in the city, something very strong, very big, very aggressive in a way. And there is another kind of ugliness, which is the ugliness represented through these amazing renderings, the watercolors and all these drawings by Lina Bobardi, which is a much more cultural and poetic and contextual. There's this reference to kind of surreal environment, or this reference to a kind of wildness, how architecture can be wild in a way, which is something that has much more depth in a way, or at least in my eyes, it's something that refers to culture, to Brazilian culture, to Italian culture, to something which is not that easy to control and to express. So I wonder where there are indeed two different kinds of ugliness, and whether, in a way, Lina Bobardi tried to for her building to have this second kind of ugliness, this kind of poetics, because this thing is not that obvious in the photographs. In the photographs, we just see an empty space underneath this huge slab, a building which is kind of silent, does not communicate that much, it's not this kind of festival.
Can we have it shorter, please, because time is of an essence.
Yeah. Sorry, so this is my question, and since Comas has this comment about Nijmegen, that Nijmegen goes for beauty, and in a way, Nijmegen's buildings are beautiful. I wonder whether Bobardi's buildings are expressing this kind of ugliness that she would like to express, and not another kind of ugliness. Sorry about my long question, and thank you.
Thank you. Can we have your question, Anna, because we're short of time?
Very quickly, thank you, Louise, and thank you, Claudia. As you know, I have been talking with Claudia, and it's very fun that Art Povera comes once again. So, you know, it's a persecution for you. But what I would like to ask you perhaps to comment or to bring this to the final discussion, the roundtable, it's perhaps this, let's say, different approach to beauty or to what is art as a cultural expression on Lina's. If you could elaborate this in connection with her own experience, because we must not forget, I think, that in the end of the 50s, she was in Bahia. And this is very, I would say, stimulating after the presentation with the Folk Museum and MoMA, now to realize Lina and her experience in Bahia and all the discoveries she did on what is a kind of let's say not primitive art, but this connection with this connection in the scope of modernity. This is a long thing. I try to make it short. I hope you understand what I mean. So it's to don't forget, just to mention to the ones that perhaps could not know this connection with the Nordeste and Bahia.
Thank you, Anna. Let me just say this. There are many other comments that you can read afterwards, Claudia. I think due to the time, we'd let you do a closing of this part of the session to pass to the next one. Claudia.
I will answer with a very personal opinion. I think that Lina, you mean that Piaget think that people understands what she has the structures to understand. I think that with the Nordeste, things go like that. I do not think that she discovered the primitive and the popular in Nordeste. If you go to the Habitat magazines, there is lots of Indian people and plumas. I don't not say them, and I understand, but not in English. Plumas and a lot of things, and I think it's in Brazilian culture, which was familiar with Mário de Andrade, also de Andrade, and all that people, they were totally interested in primitive, in folklore. It was a thing. I do not feel that she have to discover that in Nordeste. I think that she went to Nordeste and she looked for that because she had the instrumental, the mental, the intellectual apparatus to understand that. So I do not know.
Yes, I believe she had this already in her, but it makes her to be a different architect.
Yes, I think it's a sort of, well, Lina herself, I think sometimes she contributed to that vision. But I think when you go to the things he was doing, and I think when to go to before the 50s and the things she was doing during the 50s, instead I would perhaps think differently, because she designed a helicoidal staircase for MASP, which she did not build. The helicoidal staircase was perhaps closer to Reides' staircase in MoMA. And then she built a wood staircase in Bahia. But she had also designed this one for MASP. Maybe things no. I do not know if I answer you, Anna.
Yes, we must move.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, everybody, for
Thank
your
you, Louise,
input.
very much. Thank you for the questions.
This has been a very interesting presentation. We still have more time at the end, but now I have to introduce Seda Zafer, that is our last presenter of this morning. She is a young academic who lives in Istanbul. She is working as lecturer and study instructor at Simbas University in the architecture department. Also, she is a PhD candidate at Diez Technical University, the Faculty of Architecture. Her research interests are in urban context, contemporary building, ecological criticism, design, education. Therefore, this last museum we're going to see that is contemporary, is a Tadao Ando design, will bring us to part of her interest, that is contemporary building and ecological criticism. Go ahead, Seda.
Thank you. Do you hear clearly? Hello, I am Seda Zafer. I am attending this conference from Turkey as a fresh academic person. I would like to say that this is a really great chance to be part of this conference. So thank you first of all. Here I would like to present my critical paper, which name is Imported Starchitect in a Local Market. If we look the destinies of architecture that's intended to create an icon in urban scale, it has generally become the focus of fair or unfair criticism. In my paper, I want to present the contradictions of an iconic architectural object, that architectural building that bears the fame of star architect in a local environment. So I had the questions in my mind. Does a museum that take place away from the geography of the architect and differentiate with its context by its form make this building a pioneer? And another question, does architectural criticism have an affirmative role in being pioneer, new, and experimental? The building in question is Odunpazarı Modern Museum, in shortly OM, in Eskişehir, in Turkey, which was designed by Ken Gokuma very lately in 2019. First of all, let me talk a little bit about the critical dimensions of architecture. As you all know, the meaning of traditional, which does not allow the change, has moved in the opposite direction with the modern social structure. So everything that is called unchangeable has become changeable, and also with the postmodern impact, architecture discourse gained a critical dimension with the ideas, with the design ideas, texts, manifestos, projects, especially after 1980s. This process can be seen various examples critically in architecture products, images, and thoughts. And from time to time, we can see critical topics about architecture and technology, future or utopia and tradition and technology, etc. So it's clear to say that critical designs or projects should have forces that are incompatible with the existing order and increase the creative tension between what is and what is not. Also, the characteristics such as being pioneer, new, experimental, original, give architectures to privilege and allow the formation of critical ground. In this way, architecture both give praise to criticism and become the focus of the criticism. These features bring about the evolution of design building as a finished product or object because of the popularity of the building and its socially acquired functionality. It can be said that one of the most frequently criticized issues that modern or contemporary museum buildings exhibit themselves as objects rather than the objects they contain. For example, while Bilbao was a city no one wanted to go, it became one of the most famous tourism centers in the world thanks to the Guggenheim Museum. And what affected this was the building as an iconic symbol, which with its architectural form, obviously, and while cities that want visibility on the world stage aim to be illuminated by the light of a star architect, a contemporary or modern museum that is expected to be designed becomes an architectural logo signage for a city. Through this conceptual background, I would like to continue with Odunpazarı Modern Museum. As an Anatolian city, Eskişehir is not actually uninspiring as Bilbao before it was changed. On the contrary, it's really dynamic and heavily visited city, even from the other countries. Although the museum, which was built in 2019, has its own iconic and touristic symbols, the touristic brand of the historical environment of Odunpazarı, where the building is located, has already been formed by the restoration of these traditional modern wooden houses in a local environment. The name Odunpazarı as a combination of the words wood and market, that it is origin from the past where wood was traditionally sold, and this show the place is exactly opposite of the modern. Also, I would like to say that these houses are mostly replicas of old buildings that have been recently produced with up-to-date materials according to the current needs. Therefore, discussing the relationship with the environment over similarity and or difference cannot probably make one good and the other bad when we start to talk about the OM itself. At the same time, it's emphasized that the goal of the design team, especially Kengo Kuma and Yukike Gucci, developed the focus of blending nature and architecture by establishing a strong bond between the building and its location. The design team states that the developed concept under the influence of the fact that is Environment is traditionally a place where wood materials are brewed and sold. This also gives reference to the wooden building envelope and cantilevered volumes. And this distinctive wooden tectonics, kuma, created based on the Japanese tradition, as you all know, that made him star architect, and contextual discourse, which he calls anti-object, is stand against object form production. And this establishes as a actually anti-object form production establishes a healthy relationship with outside, becomes debatable and a bit superficial in this build design. According to him, the mentality of transforming almost everything into commodity in order for architecture with the purpose of the current economic system prevents establishing a healthy relationship with the outside world. And although there are points where this structure avoids being an object with the intention of establishing strong connection with the ground and being a good neighbor to the environment, the keywords such as geometry, light, clustering, wood, and which put forward by the design team and listed to be read after the end makes debatable like Bilbao effect. And its intention to selling an architecture, this building actually, and it's I want to point, like, is it possible to question that tectonic thought which wants to find the balance that expresses form and material has been interrupted? It is clear that the material has moved away from a tectonic concept that reflects the material characteristics. And at the same time, the design concept tries to give reference of clustered wooden building envelope and cantilevered forms on topography. The placement of the surrounding traditional residential fabric or pattern as random piles has been considered as a design input in shaping the fragments of the mass of Om. Here, the images also show that, however, the effect of traditional texture or pattern on the articulation is only reflected the design visually and formally. There's actually, from the design team, there wasn't any analysis and inference on the coming together of these wooden houses, wooden tectonic in a traditional way. This bit deficiency can be read through the structure's fragmented integrity and scale, which consists entirely of wood and gains a sculpture-like appearance. The wooden elements and tectonic language which are identified with Kuma's design are main elements in creating the clustering effect of this entire building, while the bay window design of the traditional houses is dynamically reflected with the withdrawals in the masses of the building with a contemporary and abstract language. On the other hand, the structural system of the building is reinforced concrete, and use of the wood as a kind of curtain wall is another matter of discussion. Wood as a very visible material is interpreted as contemporary rather than making a reference to the past. The meaning of being contemporary belong the current time directs the idea of expressing the building material as the main factor instead of cladding it. Here you can see the part section of his drawings. And Odunpazarı Modern Museum's feature of being contemporary, which is emphasized by its modern name, gives responsibility to building and its architects, while also showing that building as a modern building in a traditional environment that creates an expectation that it will be also monumental and iconic. When Kengo Kuma is the architect of modern museum, wood becomes both an element and expressed element to be expressed and modern iconic indicator. Exterior wood envelope becomes a visual element a little far from the reinterpreting the traditional construction system and tectonic thinking. The cladding wood also continues the shape, not only the exterior, as you see, but also the interior spaces. And as go inside, the objectified building annex in the outside is actually a little bit broken. It's possible to feel the tectonics of wood in interior with the effects such as the transformation of surfaces, creating into seatings and seating areas and light voids or steps, as you see in the images. The characterization of museums as warehouses that can contain gigantic works of art creates giant atriums, and the result can be challenging when such spaces are used as art galleries, although they are useful for museums as activity areas. In Ulm, the atrium that starts the entrance and continues in the lower level, and wooden elements that make up it by overlapping effect that turns into space into exhibit, provides a qualified integrity with its circulation and circulating surround, and not very gigantic scale, let's say. But as if a combination of wooden elements throughout the entire building has not been emphasized enough, and the gallery space located in the center of the building and made interesting is its wonders on the upper levels extend upward as a light space. In this image you can see clearly. This area is left blank as if it's an area that pauses the circulation at the lower level, as if encouraging to user to come, pause, and look up. The architect cannot actually get rid of objectification in the interior either. And when we look at the sense of this historical environment, which traditional houses from the silhouette suddenly change with fragmented integrity of the new building, at the same time the steps surrounding the building form an advantage by clustering between the lower level and the main road and the intermediate roads on the upper level. This is a basic concern that architects are trying to integrate the environment, and surrounding the steps with a wide floor creates an island, kind of an island, and contributes to reflecting its presence in a sculptural way, while providing at the same time users with the advantage of taking photos or spending time. This clearly shows that in this touristic world, architecture as a spectacle is not very limited in the image of the building, and the programs are actually transformed as well. The desire, the desire to experience architecture here also determines not only the facade and the mass, but also circulation of the environment. The side streets leading to the Ulm move from the current point to the point to be reached with the sequential texture of the traditional houses with a defined visual effect, and striking facade of Ulm is really slightly distant. While this creates mysterious effect in organic complexity, it also contributes to fragmented focal point of, let's say, focal point of contemporary museum. Also, it is really difficult to estimate how much the intention of the designers to recreate the traditional street inside is reflected as we enter in the indoor circulation of the building and the exhibition areas. However, the richness of space that they have created on area, approximately 3,000 square meters, is very diverse. The fact the elevations have different schemas in plan, and the gaps created by pulling back, forth and back is different in different levels, is actually varying the heights try to show the richness. This effort to create exhibition space and installation areas, different sizes inside, makes the building a fragmented box-like experience as functional at the same time. As a museum, if we think as a museum, a lively and busy place for the benefit of both administration and the audience, while the rendering the audience as passive, actually. And as a museum after the White Cube, is actually concerned about combining an old residential area with a new city as well as cultural center. We can see that this museum is trying to do this with the city vistas, using the openings, open terraces and upper levels, and the steps expanding around the building, a wide plaza that invites public use from different levels. At the same time, it's possible to this abstract kind of idea towards the white interiors of modern museum is broken with wood, but actually we go beyond it. And we can see the museum is trying to do with its city vistas, using the openings, open terraces, and but still it's not really using the wood as a kind of power to go beyond it, but not really much we can say on the even the sections we can try to see. And here is one of the recent contemporary museum example, which is considered as an example in this article. I wanted to be discussed and examined because it's a prominent building in a local area, true architect, and it's instead of focusing on the functionality and representative value of a finished product on a social basis, architectural criticism should reveal the debatable ideas with the identity of the designer and the identity values that created by the building. It's thought that this critical article produced investigations and kind of inquiries into possibilities of modern museum that can override the object's own design value. And it's seen that Kengokuma's point of view, which wants to focus on the character of material by avoiding heroic gestures, becomes a representation value in the focus of modern museum image. The modern emphasis of the building by its own definition also shows that it's not really possible to escape the density, the destiny of the attraction, becoming attraction center as an iconically created value. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Seda. And so we conclude today's speeches. I think we have a few minutes for questions regarding this lecture, and then we have a discussion without a break. It seems to me that from the keynote lecture by Frampton last night to today's lecture by Zheng Shiling, we have gone a full circle on the basic questions our two keynote speakers set up. And that is the relationship and the contrast between global practice today, especially by star architects, as we call them, and local context. So this theme that was touched upon by Zheng Shiling, and I think we thank him for being with us since his lecture very early on for 4 hours. He's still here attending. Maybe Professor Zheng, you would like to comment on this closing today's proceedings.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think today it's very active, and we can have many ideas, and also we discussed with some project, the real project, and also we discussed the foundation for critics about the knowledge base oriented criticism. Yeah, I have learned also quite a lot from the questions and also the comment. Thank you very much.
And would you say, as to the first questions to your lecture, in the way Wilfred Wang commented in the beginning, that our practices may have small differences, but we deal more or less with the same problems, whether it's the West or China. And here, whether it is a Japanese architect in the middle of Anatolia in Turkey, or whether it's a folk art museum in the middle of New York. Are the problems similar despite the different scales and distances and cultures?
Yeah, so architecture criticism is no more like traditional, but it has expanded for very extensive field and also very comprehensive. Architecture criticism should, based on different also knowledge and technology, based on different professionals. We should organize a group of critics to comment, to criticize some buildings. That will be very constructive.
Thank you. Louise, Noelle has her hand up.
Yes, I would like to go back to the presentations we just had, because I have a question. I liked it very much. I think it was enlightening of how a star architect can move and adapt or try to adapt to a smaller town. But what are the feelings, if you have any input on that, the feelings of the inhabitants of the city, and mainly the ones that live around where the museum is settled now?
Seda, the question is to you. Is that correct, Louise? Or
yes, I think yes.
Actually, as an inhabitant of the city, it becomes this, yes, it's a kind of wider plaza, kind of creating invites public use to the, in this context, in this very historical context. At the same time, it's becoming really abstract with the kind of creating trend, with the contemporary understanding, contemporary and modern focus, I can say. And also, as you know, Kengo Kuma's type of architecture, which strongly emphasizing the harmony, kind of related components such as human being, materials, substances based on accepted natural environments and life's principle. Here, it's really, as inhabitants of the city, it's very kind of new, and because of this newness, because of its varying interest, the view of the interesting appearance, it's just welcoming from the inhabitants, I can say. And maybe it's really new. It hasn't been very experienced through this since it's opened after that in pandemics, and then the people just experience this building through its steps, and which is really open and public, as you can see as you saw in the images. And yes, that's this. In my paper, I tried to see that his anti-object idea and the form production, it's not really catch this meaning in this context, I can say, with its own obvious and gigantic structure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me see if there are any other questions. The last one was, Louise, may I suggest something? And 7:25,
yes.
in the last two lectures we had, there were many questions recurring and answers on the same themes. I have made a note here. Let me just see. There is a question by Fernando Diez. This is to Seda. Fernando. Yes, there is a question.
Yes, actually, this wood tectonic as just kind of cladding over the concrete. If you realize on the sections, and it has a tectonic of those units 30 to 30 centimeters, but it is on the general. Let's say the construction system, it is not actually a wood construction system. It is a kind of cladding, kind of envelope of this closed space. And also this wood, what he actually improved as a technique, as a tectonic, rather like here in this building, like as a cladding, and has another layer of concrete inside as a carrying system. And when we look the surrounding these old houses, old traditional houses, actually mostly the original ones has interesting tectonic of Turkish houses, which wasn't very detailed analyzed, or we get interesting reference from them. The only reference we see that the cantilevered kind of form from the mass form as a wood, how I can say wood, so many woods coming as small piles into kind of spaces, let's say, if it's clear answer.
I think that's a very interesting answer to an interesting question, and I think it enriches your paper and what you have talked about so far. So I will carry on with a question from Robert MacArthur on this, which is for an architect who claims to have an anti-object intention, that's clear in Comas' writings, Comas' OMM has serious scale issues and a disappointing lack of appropriate tectonic expression. Disconnect of structure and skin and scale, large timber non-load bearing wood skin gives monumental reading that is not well integrated with the existing buildings of the immediate neighborhood. I would agree what he says, and I think it relates to your latest comment. Would you like to say some more on this, Seda?
Yeah, actually, it was my point of view mostly when I was criticizing this building. If you see this 30 centimeter wood is, and also if you add a kind of 20 centimeter concrete and this 50 centimeter thickness, it's just not for the total tectonic of this carrying the system. It's part of the, like as I said before, as a cladding.
Mm-hmm. The subject continues with another question by Burak Altinisi, which is, can I ask a rhetorical question? What is the difference of cladding a factory of prefabrication or steel construction with undulating sheets and a museum of steel structure with wood cladding? Referring to Wilfred Wang's corporate emphasis of the global business operations, are not some museums such institutions? The site is also a pseudo-historical setting, as mentioned in the presentation. So there is more discussion and a rhetorical or true question on the same subject, on cladding, and the role of cladding in this context.
Yes, exactly. And also this, it is really obvious, this prefabricated wood, it's very try to emphasize in total building, and it's trying to create a kind of total building like global works do mostly, as we see its appearance. And also this just the fragmentation and trying to integrity of the scale in this organic region was focused from the designers, let's say the design equip. And it's when we think that it is also very small local city, maybe also the parts which is involved this design, not just the Kengo Kuma. Of course, there were some other construction firms and the municipality. There is some different parts of this building. It is more like focusing on the business, like behaving like a business in this context, I can say. Maybe Mr. Wang will complete to my words.
Yes, he's raised his hand.
I was going to exactly say that. Thank you very much for your presentation, and thank you all for your presentations. On the Kengo Kuma project, I think you've put all your fingers on the big problems. I concur with your analysis and with your evaluation. The problem with Kengo Kuma, and as Ulf Meyer has pointed out in the commentary in the chat, it is probably a junior member of the office who's been given this project, and it looks like a student project where somebody has played with the SketchUp and just added the cladding, or the team in Turkey added the cladding. So you have this architect feeling compelled to use wood as his trademark and to create an icon, though pretending to be sensitive to the context. And it's an invasion into, as Buran Altinishik has pointed out, it's a quasi-invasion in an already fake context. So, you know, we are talking about kind of a really complex set of fake society and fake culture. And on the other two projects with the doomed and domed Niemeyer building, it's an invasion of contemporary mechanical systems into a historical building, which is unresolved. And in the case of the MoMA, that is resulting in the invasion of corporate culture, the mentality of corporate culture, into the world of real culture. And real culture is dead. I mean, to go back to Professor Zheng Shiling's rhetorical question, is architectural criticism dead? I think culture is dying. And architectural criticism and criticism in general is pointing this out. It's I'm not so much that criticism is dying. It is our larger culture, both global and local, that is suffering these invasions of inappropriate, as Robert McCarthy said, inappropriate responses to the different contexts, because architects are not able to read these things properly, and clients don't take responsibility for their cultural roles, especially the Museum of Modern Art. Now, on Lina Bobardi, it seems to me that this is one project that tries to liberate or give a kind of a liberating space to culture and to art and to people. It's very monumental, it's very rhetorical. And even in the first sketch, in the ceiling of the slab, there are, she has written in mirror writing, Liber, which is free, right?
Yeah.
And so it's trying to make this very big gesture as a gift to people to use and occupy this space in their different ways. So we've got this, we have three examples of invasions that are failing, and one where there is some hope, even though it's a kind of a monumentalized and rhetorical gesture.
Thank you, Wilfred. You have actually done a resume closing of today's session. I don't know if we have, do we have more time for it?
We have more time, and I think that there is probably a desire And I would like to invite, especially or maybe we should invite our colleagues from Asia first to make any points or statements, because it's now very late already. It's midnight in Asia.
You're right. We could start like that. And I was going to ask Louise before. I have noted, because there are too many questions running from the second lecture on, I have made a grouping. And maybe the people who have spoken, and the Asians first, as you say, the people who have written, if they would like to raise their hand and make their point, because they have made 3, 4, 5 points each, I will just mention them very quickly. Conversation that started with MoMA and the Folk Art Museum. We had many comments by Alexandra Staub, Ulf Mayer, Kevin Lowe, and Larissa Guimaraes. And then the conversation continued on the span of MASP by Lina Bobarti with Carlos Comas, Wilfred yourself, Rodrigo Bastos, who read it very carefully and talks about the red sky, Horatio Torrent, Rushmi Gazare, and Durganand Balsavar, and also Trenton Sexton. I've forgotten some people, but at least the names I mentioned, and of course first from Asia, because it's very late there, if they would like to raise their hands, and maybe we can stop writing and they can condense their questions. If Wilfred and Louise, if you agree, we do that? Yeah?
Yes, I would also like to have what Wilfred already stated, more of a general overview than go back to the specifics of each presentation, and think a little bit more about where we started with Professor Zheng and where we're going with high culture, and have a broader view into this. And I just have to say, to start with it, that I don't think that criticism is dying, because we've been over 100 people. Right now we're a little bit less here, sitting for 4 hours discussing buildings and architectural criticism. So at least for all these people, it's still alive. But I would like to give the floor to other people to think, to express themselves on the idea of high culture and criticism. And if Professor Zheng wants to add on it, it will be very welcome.
Thank you, Louise. I read the comment by Ulf Mayer and then Fernando. Ulf says at other conferences, the chat works like a second level conversation and comments need to be read out aloud. Would you prefer that? Of course we can do, and we have tried it, but we have accumulated too many. If we read out just yours, Ulf, I mean, I think if you said them, if you spoke about them, it would be more condensed.
Elias, it says not to be read out loudly. Not to be read out loudly. Need not be read out aloud.
Need not, yes, need not. But if you like, we leave it like that. We've read them because they run in parallel to the other sessions. As everybody feels. I have read them, but it's impossible to read all of them within the next 20 minutes. That's why I made the suggestion. I can say a couple of words if no other hands are, like Louise did, and I don't want to take much time. Kevin Lowe, yes, please.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, sure.
I just a comment to make, and take it whatever way you will. But I think it's an important discussion to have. Maybe at the end of the entire conference. But I think we're on very dangerous ground, and architectural criticism is on very dangerous ground because we've not defined where the line is drawn between subjective aesthetics and deeper concerns that we can all really share. And because it's a question of you like polka dots and like pinstripes, who's right and who's wrong? Your favorite color is purple, my favorite color is pink. The appropriate choice of material in that case is wood, whereas it should have been steel. Now, who's right and who's wrong when we talk about aesthetics? This is the big problem, is that in architectural criticism, we've kind of made ourselves a bit irrelevant. We're all a bunch of architects talking with each other about architectural criticism. I don't see any general members of the public, of the global public, participating in our event. And this is a big issue. It concerns me because I worry about our relevance. If we are not able to reach people who may not understand the language we use, if we ourselves have not brought definition to what's subjective and what is truly objective. And maybe this is a discussion we had more at the end of the entire conference, but I think this is one of the biggest problems architectural criticism faces right now, is that we've spoken ourselves and written ourselves out of a lot of relevance. And it's a concern, yeah? So sorry, I hope I have not stepped on anyone's toes.
May I say something on, Wilfred, do you want to, as a response to Kevin's?
Yeah, I'd like to respond immediately. This conference is addressed at academics and scholars and critics. It's not, it is generally open to the public. There's no restriction on that, but we didn't advertise it widely in journals or daily newspapers or anything like that. So it's not surprising that we don't have members of the general public participating. That's number one. But as Valerio Palomosco was saying yesterday, and as I believe Professor Zheng Shiling has also pointed out, there are criteria, there are methodologies which are generally accepted that we use in preservation issues, right? And as other participants have also pointed out, there is knowledge, there are facts, there are documents, there are archival things. So we can go back to certain designs and certain intentions that architects may have had 50 years, 100 years ago. We can study these. Carlos Comas was talking in these terms. And from that, we can say, these were the original intentions, these were the original ideas, this was the choice of materials, etc. Then you can place in that context, if the building is to be altered or updated or renovated, these are the choices of materials. And then you can discuss things transparently, whether objectively or not is another issue, but transparently, and you can open up the debate to a wider audience, right? And that makes the role of the critic as a midwife, so to speak, in transporting decisions from the general background of a kind of a design issue into the public realm are that much more important. And that is, I think, a very important role a critic can play. So I do believe that there is a role, and I think that that is the way that it has been working also in China and other parts of Europe, when you've got a jury making a decision about selecting a certain design and then advancing it, and then having one or even two people of the jury supervise the realization process. Now that puts an enormous amount of responsibility on both the jury and the members of the jury, no doubt. And there are some quite questionable moments when you, as quite rightly, you point out, wood or steel cladding, is that relevant or not? 5 or 4 levels of horizontal subdivisions, is that relevant or not? As in the case of that bank in Shanghai. These issues are, I mean, they may sound very flippant decisions, very superficially taken, but I'm sure there are fundamental discussions and details that are not, we cannot talk in details, in a conference like that, in those issues, but they do raise concerns about the power of a critic. So on the one hand, critics, you could say, are limited in their influence, but on the other hand, in some cases, critics have enormous influence. And so,
No, it was not my intention to suggest that we don't have a role. Of course we do. I mean, that's the reason why I'm participating, I think it's incredibly important, but I think among ourselves, I think we need to begin to have very, very intimate critical discussions about what it is exactly we're critiquing and to lay some basis of agreement.
Well,
because
that's what I'm saying.
There's so much disagreement, you know.
But that's what I think, Kevin. And just to make this final point about Valerio's notion of the grid, there is an idea that there should be a methodology. This is how I understand his word of grid, right? There must be a framework that we can all use that is general, common, and therefore objective, right? And that is a question of description, evaluation, and analysis. And these things require a kind of a common ground. And once we have that common ground, we can be more objective.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Wilfred. I think Elias wanted to say something.
No, Louise, please, you go ahead.
No. I was just trying to end a conversation to go back to you that you wanted to say something quite a while ago.
I think.
They say something in defense of Wilfred and the conference.
What
Okay,
I'm going.
Carlos,
Yes, may I say something on behalf of Wilfred and the conference?
go.
Yes, in response to Kevin, I think this is a limited affair. This is an internal affair. Yes, this is architects talking to architects about architecture, but this is part of our realization that the enemy is within the gates, you know. We are really recognizing an influence, and we are really recognizing that we have some responsibility toward the state of affairs. It's not only the question of an ignorant public or a malign public. No, I think that the real problem is, at least this is the way I understood the initiative of this conference, is the idea that if we don't clarify our positions ourselves, you know, we don't have any chance. I'm not as pessimistic as.
Thank you, Carlos. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Thank you, Carlos. Now, I think, Elias, if you want to say.
I agree with my colleagues. So I think, I don't know if you want me to carry on, but anyway, I'll say it. The danger from me, there is a danger that lingers in my mind since last night, and it's last night, Central European time, which is different from Kevin Lowe's. To me, this discussion is beyond truth and lie, some we discussed last night, beyond good and bad, form and content, or ethics and aesthetics. And I think that this conference very wisely established right from the start that architectural criticism has to address itself through talking about buildings, about architecture, about the thing itself. Now, where are we, and is this a closed circle of professionals? Yes, but Professor Zheng Shiling is here, and he talked about the 200 juries and the 30,000 buildings that have gone up, and some of us, some architects were there, or some critics. So how do we come together, and what do we talk about? I think it's not a contrast of these dualities, because let's take ethics and aesthetics. Ethics is not about morality in architecture. Ethics is about ethos. Ethos is the manner, the way in which we do things. I think it's closer to what Wilfred yesterday described as crafts. Which would that way be? As far as it concerns critics, I think we had many good lectures, but Comas and Almeida's lecture and the emphasis on description, then evaluation, Wilfred mentioned already, so shows how we can solidly approach to read, to look at and discuss a building in a way. I wanted to ask you before, Carlos, what you said about the Mendes Rosa phase and the Niemeyer phase, the first one, is a discussion that any architects within an office, and I might say to Kevin, even with clients, even with the planning authorities, are having every day. What Carlos Comas is the discussions we have in an office. When we design and plan a building, we visit them, we look at them, we look at drawings, we experience the space, and on the basis of that, we go ahead with our designs. So I think both the practice of architecture and criticism are critical in their essence. I think what Claudia Costa Cabral showed us today was how Lina Bobardi was critical of what she was doing by just looking at through drawings. She delved into the process of design, which was critical by the architect himself. So if Kevin's question would be, or whoever's, what is appropriate? What is objective? I think appropriate, if that is the essence of what we're doing, is what we're all discussing, and it is always to be negotiated. It is always to be discovered. 100 years ago, what was appropriate was the machine age, was social housing. Ask anybody on this table or in schools what is appropriate today. They will talk about sustainability. They will talk about the environment, regardless of whether they do it or not. So appropriateness, and Kevin very rightly yesterday himself said that you have to look, what is this building for? Is it a museum? We haven't talked about. Is it a hospital? The example from Turkey, from Eski Sehir, was the context. What is the context? So appropriateness, I think, will bring us back to the question of what we are doing and how we relate as critics to architects, to other architects, to clients. Sorry I've taken so long. It's been lingering.
I think it's good. I think we might be getting to a closing time. I don't know what Wilfred will say. He always say like that. So it means I would like to conclude first thanking Professor Zheng, thanking the 5 presenters of today for their input, for the work, for bringing about different approaches and views to criticism, to architecture. Thanking again Wilfred for his guidance, for the idea of getting all this well-organized amount of people together. And I think we're all learning a lot, being here for plus 4 hours plus, being very happy. And we'll see everybody next weekend. But Wilfred, you can close.
Thank you, Louise, and thank you, Elias, for your co-chairmanship this session. I think it's been a very spirited discussion and a series of very inspirational presentations. I'd like to thank all the speakers as well. We are going to move into the realm of criticism and its effects and explicit criticism. So Martin Hartung, I hope you can join us next weekend because that's where we're going to get into the real meat of things. As you were saying, you know, what is the role of criticism and what is its effect? And there are plenty of good examples of the maybe questionable effects of criticism and the way that criticism has been instrumentalized in some cases. Those arguments will be made. So I hope that you will all join us on Saturday and Sunday next weekend. I just want to make one more final personal comment that it has been said by Kenneth Frampton that he, 90 years old, sees himself very much as, of course, out of touch with regard to some of the recent literature and maybe even some of the recent works of architecture. And so I certainly see it as my role in establishing this kind of conference to open the doors to the next generations of architectural critics and architectural theoreticians to join the ranks of future critics. So I think this platform can serve that purpose, and I hope you're all enjoying the moment and the opportunity as much as we are. So thank you all for your contribution and for your participation, and see you next weekend, this time next week.
Have a great weekend. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Zheng.
Thank you.
Have a good night's sleep.
Thank you. Goodbye, everybody. See you next week.
Bye, Louise.